The History of Grave Robbing, Medical Body Snatching in the Victorian and Edwardian Eras. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. 1. Introduction. The practice of grave robbing, known in 18th and 19th century Britain as body snatching, sits at the uneasy junction of scientific modernity and social fear. It was not merely a criminal sideline feeding the morbid appetites of medical men, it was a structural response to a legal and cultural contradiction. British medicine increasingly demanded routine anatomical dissection to train surgeons and physicians, yet the state and the public simultaneously treated dissection as a post-mortem disgrace. That contradiction produced a market in which the dead, particularly the dead without wealth, status, or protectors, became vulnerable to covert extraction and commercial exchange. To write the history of body snatching in the Victorian and Edwardian eras is therefore to write a history of institutions as much as of criminals. Resurrectionists were the most visible agents of the trade, but they operated within a wider ecology, private anatomy schools competing for students, hospitals professionalizing surgical training, parish burial grounds with limited resources, and a press increasingly able to convert local outrages into national scandals. The illicit traffic in corpses also depended upon respectable forms of concealment. Medical lecturers frequently cultivated ignorance regarding the precise origin of the bodies they dissected, while simultaneously maintaining relationships with intermediaries who ensured supply. The result was a system in which criminality and legitimacy were not opposites but collaborators, separated by carefully maintained deniability. This book focuses on the period from the late 18th century through the early 20th century, with particular attention to the decades surrounding the Anatomy Act 1832. The Act is often narrated as a decisive endpoint. Parliament intervenes, body snatching collapses, and medical education proceeds on legal foundations. In practice, the Act reorganized the procurement of human remains more than it eliminated controversy. It introduced a bureaucratic framework of licensing and inspection, and it expanded legal access to bodies that were unclaimed or held under lawful possession, a formulation that would disproportionately map onto the institutional dead of workhouses and hospitals. The law's own language made clear that the state understood the stakes. It presented regulation as necessary because, in the scramble for anatomical material, great and grievous crimes had occurred, and lately murder committed for the single object of selling the bodies of the murdered. The Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, witnessed both the consolidation of medical authority and the hardening of class inequalities in death. In that world, burial was not merely disposal, it was a ritual claim to identity and dignity. The disturbance of the grave was experienced as an assault not only on the dead but on the living, on family honor, religious sentiment, and the boundary separating the human from the merely material. This helps explain why the politics of cadavers generated such heat. Anatomists frequently defended dissection as an indispensable instrument of knowledge, necessary to understand disease, trauma, and the body's internal architecture. Their opponents framed it as desecration, an extension of punishment beyond the grave, and when directed toward the poor, as a sign that poverty itself had become a moral stain requiring bodily extraction even after death. The most notorious episodes in the pre-1832 crisis, Burke and Hare in Edinburgh, 1828, and the London Burkers, 1831, have often been told as lurid morality tales. Depraved murderers supply a callous medical market. Yet such cases matter historically because they expose to public view what respectable society preferred not to see. They rendered visible the continuum between grave robbing and homicide. If bodies were valuable and supply was scarce, then the step from stealing the dead to producing the dead could become frighteningly rational. That Parliament's eventual reform explicitly invoked murder committed for the sale of bodies is itself evidence that legislators understood the danger not as theoretical but as already realized. This manuscript is also attentive to the empire. As medical education expanded in Britain's colonial territories, the same structural pressures recurred, often with additional layers of racialization and dehumanization. In settler colonies, indigenous bodies were frequently treated not as members of a community entitled to funerary integrity, but as specimens suited to anatomical and anthropological collection. Colonial contexts therefore did not merely replicate British practices, they often intensified the imbalance of power that made appropriation possible, embedding the trade in remains within broader projects of governance, scientific classification, and territorial control. Methodologically, this study draws on parliamentary reports, contemporary medical writing, and institutional records, as well as the rare first-person documentation of resurrectionist practice. Among the most valuable sources for London is the surviving diary of a resurrectionist active in 1811-12, preserved by the Royal College of Surgeons and subsequently digitized, an unusually granular account of how a body-snatching enterprise tracked burials, managed risk, and maintained commercial relationships. Such sources allow the historian to resist two temptations: to romanticize resurrectionists as folk devils operating outside society, or to sanitize the medical institutions that purchase their wares. Instead, the evidence reveals a market formed at the intersection of pedagogy, law, and inequality. Ultimately, the history of grave robbing is not merely macabre. It is a history of how modern medicine secured its foundational knowledge, and of what, and who, paid for that knowledge. The choices made in the 19th century shaped public trust, ethical norms, and the later development of consent-based frameworks for post-mortem use of bodies. The legacy is therefore double-edged. Dissection helped produce safer surgery and deeper anatomical understanding, yet the social conditions under which bodies were acquired often entrenched the idea that the poor were available to the state in death as they were constrained by it in life. 2. The legal framework, from the Murder Act to the anatomy. 2.1 Dissection as punishment and the symbolic economy of the corpse. The legal foundations of Britain's anatomical supply crisis were laid in the 18th century, when the state began to use the criminal corpse as both warning and resource. The Murder Act, commonly dated to 1752 but often cited as 25 Go 2c.37 due to sessional dating, sought to add further terror and a peculiar mark of infamy to the punishment of murder. The murderer's body was not to be treated as an ordinary dead body entitled to burial rites. Instead, it was to be subjected to post-execution sanctions, notably dissection or hanging in chains. This mattered for medical history because it tethered anatomy to the scaffold. Dissection entered public consciousness not as a neutral scientific practice, but as a continuation of state violence. It was punishment written onto flesh, an assault on the integrity of the corpse that many Christians understood as part of the person's moral narrative, even after death. In practical terms, the act offered anatomists a supply of bodies that was legally uncontested precisely because the bodies had been marked as forfeited by crime. But symbolically it also ensured that the public would continue to interpret dissection through the lens of disgrace. The state's attempt to deter murder by threatening dismemberment also deterred consent. Few wished their relatives, or themselves, to become subjects for the knife. Historians have emphasized that the Murder Act did not simply increase the number of bodies made available to surgeons, it reorganized the category of bodies that could be legitimately used. By concentrating post-mortem dissection on murderers, the Act defined a narrow legal class of corpse whose violation was not only permitted but commanded. The medical utility was real, yet it came packaged with a cultural message. Dissection was what happened to those who fell beyond the moral community. 2.2 No property in a corpse, and the loophole that enabled a market. If the Murder Act created a symbolic bridge between law and anatomy, common law created a practical loophole. In broad terms, English common law long resisted the idea that a corpse could be owned as property in the ordinary sense. This produced a paradox. Families experienced the body as profoundly theirs in moral and emotional terms, yet the legal system often struggled to treat corpse-taking as theft in the same manner as goods. In practice, body snatchers exploited this ambiguity. They frequently left behind clothing, jewelry, and grave goods, items that clearly could be stolen, and targeted only the body. This calculated restraint was not reverence but risk management. It could reduce the severity of charges and narrow the scope of prosecution. The law did not lack tools to punish grave violation, but penalties were often inconsistent and, in many jurisdictions, less severe than those associated with property theft. The result was predictable. Where demand and profit were high, the risks became a cost of doing business. This legal landscape helped produce the resurrectionist as a recognizable occupational type, an individual who could expect periodic arrest or assault, but who could also anticipate continued customers among anatomy teachers desperate for supply. 2.3 The expansion of anatomy education and the collapse of the scaffold supply. By the early 19th century, medical education was undergoing a transformation. Surgery's status rose, hospitals expanded, and anatomy became central to professional identity. Teaching increasingly emphasized hands-on dissection rather than purely demonstrative lectures. Students expected to see and touch, teachers promised practical mastery, and competitive schools required a steady stream of bodies to maintain reputations and enrollments. The result was a demand curve that the scaffold could never meet. Parliament recognized this gap with growing alarm, culminating in the Select Committee on Anatomy, 1828, which gathered evidence on the state of anatomical teaching and the crisis produced by illicit supply networks. The committee's very existence is significant. It signals that by the late 1820s, legislators understood body snatching not as a minor disorder but as a systemic problem undermining social peace and producing incentives for worse crimes. One of the committee's most consequential implications, made explicit in later commentary, is that the shortage of legal bodies had begun to harm Britain's medical competitiveness. If continental schools could secure cadavers more easily, they could offer more robust training. British schools either lagged or relied on criminal suppliers. Thus, reform was framed not only as moral necessity but as a matter of national capacity. 2.4 Parliamentary Logic in 1832, Regulation as Crime Prevention. When Parliament finally enacted the Anatomy Act 1832, it did so with a rationale stated unusually plainly. Anatomical knowledge was essential, legal supply was insufficient, and the resulting shortage had led to great and grievous crimes, including lately murder committed to sell bodies for dissection. This preamble is more than decorative. It shows the state positioning itself as balancing two public goods: protection of the dead from violation and protection of the living through better medical training, while also seeking to prevent the escalation from grave robbing to homicide revealed by recent scandals. Structurally, the Act introduced three key mechanisms: licensing of practitioners of anatomy, via the Home Department, intended to confine dissection to regulated spaces and identifiable persons. Inspection and reporting, with inspectors tasked with monitoring where bodies were held and dissected. Bureaucracy as a substitute for secrecy. A broadened lawful supply based on lawful possession and the absence of a relative's objection, an attempt to establish a consent-like mechanism without requiring explicit consent in every case. In theory, this framework severed medical education from the resurrectionists by making legal acquisition routine. In practice, it shifted the social burden of supply. Bodies that were most likely to be unclaimed were those already held within institutions of poverty and marginality, workhouses, charitable hospitals, prisons. The state did not need to say paupers in order to build a system that would reliably produce pauper corpses. 2.5 The Anatomy Act is a settlement, not a moral consensus. The Act was a political settlement rather than a cultural reconciliation. Crowds did not suddenly accept dissection as benign. Indeed, popular protest continued because many understood correctly that the new regime would protect the burial integrity of the respectable while exposing the institutional dead to medical use. The Act therefore ended one form of scandal grave violation by normalizing another, class-differentiated vulnerability in death. It reduced the incentive for resurrectionist gangs to raid graves, but it did not eliminate the fear that the poor would be harvested by authorities the moment they died behind institutional walls. From a historian's perspective, the legal framework between the Murder Act and the Anatomy Act demonstrates how the state repeatedly used the corpse as an instrument, first as a tool of terror and infamy to deter crime, then as a regulated resource to sustain professional training, and finally, implicitly, as a mechanism through which poverty could be converted into anatomical capital. That conversion would define the Victorian chapter of this history, as the workhouse system expanded and the trade in the dead poor became bureaucratically routine. 3. The rise of the resurrection men. Professional body snatchers. 3.1 From opportunists to an organized supply chain. The popular image of the body snatcher in late Georgian and early Victorian Britain is that of a lone nocturnal criminal, scrambling in the mud with a spade and lantern, driven by desperation or depravity. Contemporary satire and later Gothic fiction reinforced this caricature, emphasizing secrecy, superstition, and horror. Yet the historical record, especially where it survives in unusually granular form, suggests that by the early 19th century resurrectionism had become something closer to a service industry operating at the boundary of legality, supplying a predictable commodity to a predictable market. The transformation of body snatching from episodic grave violation into professionalized commerce is one of the central developments that made the cadaver crisis not merely a moral panic but a structural problem in British urban life. This professionalization was propelled by a basic economic fact. The expansion of medical education and the premium placed on fresh bodies created a strong incentive to build routines capable of delivering cadavers quickly and repeatedly. Parliament later acknowledged that the legal supply was insufficient and that serious crimes, including lately murder, had been committed to meet demand. That phrasing makes little sense unless legislators already understood that a market with persistent shortages had generated persistent criminal enterprise. The resurrection men were therefore not simply thieves of the dead. They were intermediaries in a system that connected burial grounds to dissecting rooms, and that depended on intelligence, logistics, and discretion. Their targets were shaped by urban geography, which graveyards were accessible, which regarded, by social structure, which families could pay for protection, which could not, and by institutional practice, how quickly bodies were buried, how long they remained useful to anatomists. Their methods and networks matured in response to resistance, watches, patrols, mortsafes, and rumors, and in response to the need to maintain working relationships with anatomists while preserving plausible deniability. 3.2 Language, trade identity, and the euphemism of subjects. The body trade developed its own vocabulary, much of it designed to reduce the psychological shock of the work and to signal belonging within a semi-covert profession. Bodies were commonly referred to as subjects, a term that was also widely used by medical teachers and students. The overlap is revealing. It suggests not only a shared language but a shared conceptual distancing. The corpse became a teaching object. The subject was materially valuable because it could be opened, displayed, and divided. In resurrectionist circles, slang and euphemism had practical functions. They allowed transactions to be arranged in semi-public environments, taverns, alleyways, near gates, without explicit reference to corpses. A coded economy can thrive only when its participants can communicate without constantly risking detection. The more routine the trade became, the more important this semi-opaque language became, not only for secrecy but for efficiency. 3.3 The strongest window into the trade, the 1811-12 London Diary. For many parts of Britain, the resurrectionist trade is documented primarily through prosecutions, newspaper panic, or moralising commentary. Such sources are valuable, but they are often episodic: a raid here, a riot there, an outraged sermon, an anxious pamphlet. London is exceptional because we possess a rare document that records the trade from the inside, an 1811-1812 diary attributed to Joseph Naples, a working resurrectionist linked to a gang operating under a leader often identified as Ben Crouch. The Royal College of Surgeons of England has emphasized the diary's importance as an actual written account of body snatching activity in London during that period, preserved and later digitized for researchers. The diary is not a confession or a sensational narrative. It reads, more disturbingly, like business notes. It records nights out, numbers of bodies obtained, the movement of men between burial grounds, and the delivery of bodies to customers. Because it treats corpses as units and nights as shifts, it reveals professional body snatching as a labor practice. Another accessible transcription hosted by Newcastle University illustrates the diary's style: brief entries, practical details, repeated locations, and what appears to be a regular rhythm of work. Two aspects of the diary are particularly important for historians: routine and repetition. The diary's repetitive structure implies that resurrectionism had become normalized as nightly labor, with established practices and expectations. Coordination. The entries suggest groups working together rather than lone individuals, and imply the existence of meeting points, storage arrangements, and known routes. These characteristics are consistent with a trade that had matured into an informal supply chain. 3.4 Organization and roles within resurrectionist gangs. Professional resurrectionist groups tended to operate with a division of labor. Although the specific structure varied by city and gang size, the basic roles often included scouts or informants, individuals who identified fresh burials, monitored security, and assessed risk. In practice, this scouting could be conducted by attending funerals or cultivating relationships with those who worked near burial grounds. Diggers, the physical laborers who opened the grave and extracted the coffin or corpse. Carriers and transport handlers, those who moved the body swiftly away from the burial ground to a safe place, then onward to an anatomy school. Brokers or dealers, figures who negotiated with medical schools and coordinated delivery, pricing, and timing. The broker role was crucial. It insulated anatomists from direct contact with graveyard labor and insulated laborers from the institutional authority of hospitals and colleges. It also enabled the broker to manage the market, setting prices, allocating bodies to customers, and prioritizing fresh deliveries to those who paid best. The existence of a broker class helps explain why anatomists could plausibly claim ignorance while still benefiting from a reliable supply. The Anatomy Act later attempted to replace this gray market brokerage with licensed, inspected procurement, an acknowledgement that the problem was not merely criminal behavior but a system that had outgrown ad hoc policing. 3.5 How bodies were taken: technique, speed, and minimal theft. Resurrectionists were not engaged in conventional grave looting. Their aim was to obtain the body while minimizing evidence that would trigger a serious theft charge or inflame public outrage even further. One widely reported strategy was taking the corpse but leaving clothing and valuables. This practice served multiple purposes. It reduced the time required at the grave, reduced the risk of being caught with identifiable stolen property, and exploited the legal ambiguities around corpse theft that made prosecution more complex than straightforward property crime. The extraction method most commonly described in contemporary accounts involved opening the grave at the head end, to reduce digging, breaking or prizing open the coffin lid, and pulling the body out, often with ropes or hooks, then refilling the grave to conceal disturbance. The goal was speed. Work had to be completed during hours when patrols were least effective and witnesses few. The professional element lay in reducing labor time, coordinating multiple hands, and knowing which burial grounds offered the best ratio of reward to risk. The diary evidence reinforces this image of efficiency and repetition. Brief notes, multiple bodies in a single night, movement between locations, and immediate delivery. 3.6 Burial ground geography. Why some cemeteries were raided and others avoided. Resurrectionists did not target burial grounds randomly. They developed working maps of the city's death infrastructure, where the poor were buried, where the watch was strongest, where a bribe was feasible, where walls could be scaled, where exits were quick. As London expanded, it offered both opportunity and complexity. More burials meant more potential bodies, but also more public alarm and more security measures. Pauper burial grounds and overcrowded urban cemeteries were especially vulnerable. They were often poorly guarded, their staff underpaid, and their graves densely packed, conditions that paradoxically aided body snatchers by making disturbance harder to detect. By contrast, wealthier burial spaces, where families could pay for better coffins, private plots, and sometimes physical protections, were less attractive targets. This class-skewed targeting of graves prefigured what the Anatomy Act later formalized, shifting the supply of bodies toward the poor, especially those dying in institutions. 3.7 Economics of the trade. Pricing, freshness, and bodily quality. The resurrectionist economy operated with practical pricing logic. Prices varied according to freshness. A body taken soon after burial commanded a higher price because it was more useful for teaching and dissection. Age and size. Adult bodies often yielded more anatomical instruction, musculature, organ scale, surgical practice, and therefore were typically more valuable than infants or small children in the market logic. Condition. Disease, decomposition, and trauma could make a corpse less desirable for certain teaching purposes. Because anatomy teaching depended on showing structures clearly and because preservation methods were limited before later innovations, the market rewarded speed. Speed, in turn, rewarded organization. Organization rewarded professionalization. This circular logic is one reason body snatching became so systematic before 1832. Demand was not occasional, it was built into the calendar of courses, lectures, and student expectations. 3.8 Relationships with anatomists. Deniability as a business practice. Medical schools and private anatomy lecturers often relied on resurrectionists while maintaining an outward stance of legality and respectability. The relationship was shaped by a shared need for distance. Anatomists wanted bodies but did not want direct connection to grave robbery. Resurrectionists wanted reliable customers but did not want to be easily identified by authorities through institutional testimony. This produced a set of delivery practices designed to preserve deniability. Deliveries at odd hours, receiving bodies through intermediaries, coded messages, and informal understandings about what questions would not be asked. The Anatomy Act's later insistence on licensed teachers, inspectors, and documented handling of bodies can be read as the state's attempt to force the shadow system into legible administration. 3.9 Risk and violence, a trade conducted under threat. The resurrectionists' greatest immediate danger often came not from the state but from communities. In an era when the integrity of burial was tied to religious feeling and family honor, grave violation could provoke rapid collective violence. Community patrols, cemetery watches, and spontaneous crowds were common features of the body-snatching landscape. The risk of being beaten, maimed, or even killed by outraged locals was real, and it helped shape resurrectionist tactics, stealth, speed, retreat routes, and the cultivation of inside information to avoid guarded grounds. This violence also shaped the politics of reform. As public outrage grew, the state faced a dilemma: either increase punitive policing of body snatchers, treating the symptom, or expand legal supply and regulate anatomical practice, addressing the market. Parliament's own preamble to the Anatomy Act explicitly framed regulation as a way to prevent great and grievous crimes that the shortage had generated. 3.10 The 1828 Select Committee and the recognition of a national crisis. By the late 1820s, the resurrectionist trade was not merely a London oddity but a national scandal, and Parliament's 1828 Select Committee on Anatomy marks a pivotal moment when the state formally gathered evidence about anatomy teaching and cadaver supply. The report survives as a substantial document and offers a clear sign that the issue had moved from sporadic outrage to legislative consideration. What mattered most about the committee's work was its implicit diagnosis: the trade existed because anatomy teaching required bodies and because lawful sources were insufficient. Once the problem was framed this way, grave robbing could no longer be treated solely as criminal deviance. It was evidence of an institutional contradiction: medicine's needs versus society's horror of dissection and the law's narrow supply channels. 3.11 The approach of 1832, why professional resurrectionism became unsustainable. Professional resurrectionism reached a point of peak intensity before 1832, but its long-term prospects were already threatened by three converging pressures. Public countermeasures intensified: watches, guards, and protective devices raised the costs and risks. Scandals escalated: the cases of Burke and Hare and later, the London Burkers shifted public perception from theft to murder for profit, heightening pressure on legislators. Legislative momentum grew. Parliamentary investigation created the conditions for reform that would restructure supply. When the Anatomy Act passed, August 1, 1832, it sought to end dependence on resurrectionists by allowing licensed practitioners to obtain bodies through regulated means and by establishing inspectors who monitored where bodies were being dissected. In practical effect, it rerouted supply toward institutional deaths and made the old graveyard model less profitable and more risky. This did not mean the end of every illicit practice, nor did it resolve ethical controversy. It did mean that the resurrectionist, once the key intermediary between cemetery and dissecting room, was increasingly displaced by a new system in which administrators, workhouse authorities, and medical institutions played the central role. The trade did not simply vanish, it changed its legal clothing. 3.12 Conclusion: Resurrectionists as products of a medical economy. The resurrection men were the most visible villains in a drama that Victorians often framed in moral terms: impious thieves violating graves to satisfy scientific curiosity. Yet the evidence suggests they were also the predictable product of an economy in which bodies were demanded as teaching material and the law provided too few. The 1811-12 diary offers a particularly stark demonstration of how routine the work could become, how the dead were counted, moved, and sold in a system that functioned night after night. To understand resurrectionists historically is therefore not to excuse their actions but to locate them within a broader structure: medical professionalization, legal shortage, class vulnerability, and public fear. In the next chapter, that structure's most infamous rupture, Burke and Hare, will show what happened when scarcity and profit logic crossed the boundary from stealing bodies to manufacturing them. Burke and Hare. When body snatching became murder. 4.1 Edinburgh's Anatomy Economy and the Logic of Scarcity. To understand why the Burke and Hare murders became such a decisive turning point, they must be placed within the particular anatomy economy of early 19th century Edinburgh. Edinburgh was not merely another British city with medical teaching, it was a major European centre for anatomical instruction, drawing students from across the British Isles and beyond. That reputation depended on the ability of lecturers to provide what students most desired and what competitors struggled to supply: regular, hands-on dissection of recently deceased bodies. This demand was not an incidental feature of medical teaching, it was central to a rapidly professionalizing culture that increasingly valued empirical observation over book learning. Anatomy was taught not just as an abstract system but as tactile knowledge. Muscle layers, vascular routes, organ relations, best understood through repeated exposure to real bodies. When lawful supply could not match the rhythm of courses and the expectations of paying students, illicit supply became normalized. Parliament later stated in the preamble to the Anatomy Act that the legal supply of human bodies is insufficient, and that great and grievous crimes, and lately murder, had been committed for the single object of selling the bodies of the persons so murdered. That wording is often quoted because it is unusually direct. The state publicly linked cadaver shortage to the emergence of murder-for-corpse markets. Edinburgh's problem was intensified by the limited lawful pipeline of bodies available for dissection at this time and by the intense competition among private anatomy teachers. In practice, this meant that the line between resurrectionism grave robbing, and outright homicide could be crossed when the costs and risks of conventional body snatching increased. Burke and Hare's significance historically lies in how they operationalized this crossing. They treated bodies as a commodity to be produced, not merely stolen. 4.2 Robert Knox and the market for fresh bodies. The murders are inseparable from the figure of Dr. Robert Knox, whose private anatomy teaching and dissecting rooms at Surgeon Square provided Burke and Hare with a lucrative outlet. Knox was widely known as a gifted lecturer and prominent anatomist. The University of Edinburgh's alumni profile notes his reputation prior to the scandal and his subsequent infamy due to involvement in the Burke and Hare affair. Knox's role is morally and historiographically complex. He was never convicted or formally punished as an accessory to murder, yet his willingness to purchase bodies without asking difficult questions was widely criticized in Edinburgh. Even summaries of the episode note that public anger focused not only on the killers, but on the anatomist who had bought the bodies and seemed insulated by professional status. The financial incentives were not subtle. Contemporary and later accounts commonly report that Burke and Hare received substantial sums per body. Figures in the range of £7 to £10 appear repeatedly in discussions of their transactions with Knox's school. What mattered was not only the money but the preference for bodies that were exceptionally fresh. Freshness was a functional requirement. Decomposition hindered dissection, while recently dead bodies allowed clearer demonstration of anatomy. A buyer's premium for freshness therefore rewarded suppliers who could deliver bodies quickly, and in the extreme, encouraged those who could deliver bodies without the delays and uncertainties of grave robbery. 4.3 The accidental beginning, Donald's death and the first sale. The Burke and Hare enterprise is often described as beginning by chance. A lodger in William Hare's lodging house died owing rent, and rather than bear the loss, Hare and Burke sought to monetize the corpse. This initial transaction, selling the body to Knox's dissecting rooms, demonstrated the existence of a ready buyer and a workable price. Once that pathway was proven, it created the conditions for the next step. If a dead body could reliably be converted into cash, then bodies themselves could become a form of income. The mechanics of that conversion also mattered. Edinburgh's resurrectionist networks were already established. The city was no stranger to body snatching and the anxieties it provoked. The difference with Burke and Hare was that they were not skilled professional resurrectionists in the traditional sense. Grave robbing required tools, teamwork, cemetery knowledge, and the ability to evade guards and angry communities. Manufacturing bodies required something else: access to vulnerable people, a private space, and a method of killing that would leave minimal visible injury. 4.4 Burking as method, an innovation in concealment. The killing method associated with the pair, later called burking, was chosen because it was effective and comparatively difficult to detect without close examination. Many later summaries describe it as smothering and chest compression, producing death while reducing obvious external trauma. Care must be taken here. Forensic certainty varies by case and by what later writers assumed. What is historically secure is that their approach was designed to avoid conspicuous wounds and to deliver bodies that could pass, at least briefly, as natural deaths to a buyer inclined not to look too hard. The method's cultural afterlife is revealing. Burking entered popular vocabulary as a verb precisely because it captured a new fear, not merely that graves might be violated, but that people, especially the socially marginal, might be killed to supply medical science. That fear, in turn, helped convert a long-running grave robbery problem into a national political crisis. 4.5 Choosing victims, vulnerability as selection criterion. The Westport murders targeted those least likely to be defended in life or in death: the poor lodgers without strong kin networks, individuals on society's edges. Even concise modern summaries emphasize that Burke and Hare murdered people to sell their bodies for dissection. This victim selection was not incidental. It reflected the practical requirements of concealment in an urban setting. A victim with close family, stable employment, or a prominent social footprint posed higher risks. Questions would be asked, searches conducted, rumors amplified. By contrast, those already treated as disposable by society could disappear with less immediate scrutiny. Here, the murders mirrored the broader class dynamics of cadaver supply. Long before the Anatomy Act formalized a system that disproportionately drew upon the institutional poor, the illicit market had already developed a class-skewed logic. The bodies easiest to obtain, with the least risk of retaliation, tended to be the bodies of those with the least power. 4.6 Detection and collapse, the final body and the lodging house discovery. Accounts differ in narrative detail, but the core pattern is consistent. the enterprise collapsed when a body was discovered before it could be delivered to the anatomist, and witnesses alerted authorities. A key strength for historians is the survival of contemporary trial documentation, including published accounts of proceedings against William Burke and Helen Dougal, which describe the legal framing of the case and the reliance on testimony from the accomplice who turned King's evidence. The legal mechanism that brought Burke down was also instructive. William Hare agreed to testify against Burke, an arrangement that outraged many and fed public anger about unequal justice. The result reinforced a moral narrative that persisted long after the event. The criminal market existed because respectable institutions would buy bodies, and the law seemed better able to punish individual villains than to confront the structural incentives that made villains profitable. 4.7 Trial Outcomes and Poetic Justice, Execution and Dissection. Burke was convicted and sentenced to death. The details of his execution date and subsequent dissection appear in multiple summaries, including standard reference accounts. The subsequent public dissection of Burke's body carried a symbolic charge that Victorian commentators could scarcely resist. The man who sold bodies for dissection became, after death, a body dissected. This moment fused three strands of British legal medical culture. The tradition of dissection as punishment, which had been legally encoded in the earlier Murder Act framework. The public spectacle of criminal justice, execution crowds, moral theatre, and the pedagogical needs of anatomy, which turned even the murderer's corpse into an educational resource. The story's moral symmetry was compelling, but it did not resolve the deeper question: if the legal supply of bodies remained insufficient, what would prevent the next crisis? 4.8 Knox after the scandal, professional fallout without prosecution. Knox's fate demonstrated how professional reputation could be damaged even without criminal conviction. Summaries of his biography note that he was not prosecuted and that Edinburgh public opinion remained hostile, including mob actions against his property and pressure that contributed to later professional consequences. The enduring anger reflected a public sense that the anatomy market had been protected by status. Even if Knox did not personally participate in murder, the argument ran, he created a commercial environment in which murder became a rational supply strategy. For historians, Knox's contested role highlights a central feature of the body trade: plausible deniability. Anatomists could claim ignorance while benefiting from a supply chain that could not plausibly be sustained without criminality. The Anatomy Act's later insistence on licensing and inspection can be read as an attempt to replace deniable arrangements with bureaucratic legibility, though, as later chapters will show, the new system created its own injustices. 4.9 Political Impact, from Scandal to Statute. The Burke and Hare murders did not by themselves pass the Anatomy Act, but they substantially changed what could be said in public and what Parliament could plausibly ignore. They provided an extreme example that validated long-standing fears, that a market in corpses, under conditions of scarcity, could produce escalating violence. The Anatomy Act's preamble explicitly refers to lately murder committed to sell bodies, a legislative acknowledgement that the Burke and Hare type scenario was not a Gothic fantasy but a policy problem. The murders also reshaped the rhetorical balance between medical reformers and popular resistance. Reformers could now argue that regulation was not merely a convenience for medical schools, it was necessary to prevent further crimes. Opponents could respond that the true solution was not to legalize anatomical acquisition, but to protect the poor from being transformed into a resource, whether by resurrectionists or by the state. The crisis thus placed Parliament in a bind: continue tolerating an illicit market that bred scandal and risked murder, or establish a legal pipeline that would inevitably draw on the institutional dead, bodies held in workhouses and hospitals, thereby shifting the moral burden onto the poor. The Anatomy Act was the chosen solution, and its language is frank about its intent: to protect anatomical study under certain regulations, and thereby prevent the crimes that shortage had fostered. 4.10 Conclusion: Why Burke and Hare mattered beyond the horror. Burke and Hare matter historically for reasons deeper than their notoriety. They revealed the market logic beneath a practice often treated as aberrant. Grave robbery had already normalized the idea that bodies could be procured through crime. The Westport murders demonstrated that under scarcity, bodies could also be procured through killing. The case forced the public and the state to confront the uncomfortable reality that medical education, highly valued, even celebrated, was supported by practices that many regarded as sacrilege and that could tip into lethal violence. In that sense, Burke and Hare served as a grim hinge between two regimes. The older semi-tolerated world of resurrectionists supplying schools through grave violation, and the emerging administrative regime in which the state would regulate anatomy and expand legal access to bodies, especially the bodies of those who died without resources or protectors. The next chapter follows the crisis into London, where the Burkers model reappeared in the imperial capital, intensifying public panic and providing further momentum toward the Anatomy Act's passage. 5. The London Burkers and the Crisis of 1831. 5.1 London after Burke and Hare, fear becomes expectation. If Burke and Hare shattered any remaining complacency about the body trade in Scotland, London in 1831 turned that shock into a national crisis. The capital had long been a major consumer of anatomical material, sustained by private schools, hospital teaching, and an urban scale of death that simultaneously increased supply opportunities and intensified public fear. Yet even after Edinburgh's scandal, many Londoners could still imagine burking as a distant aberration, a Scottish horror, not an English one. The discovery in late 1831 that a London group had been murdering people to sell their bodies to anatomists destroyed that distance. The significance of the London case lies in timing and symbolism. It erupted when Parliament was already investigating anatomy and when the public mood was tense, socially, economically, and politically. It therefore did not land as a single criminal episode. It landed as proof that the state's inability to regulate cadaver supply had created a predictable, portable market incentive. Where bodies were valuable, suppliers would find ways to obtain them. That is why the Anatomy Act's preamble, passed the following year, explicitly links insufficient legal supply to great and grievous crimes, and lately murder committed for the single object of selling the bodies of the persons so murdered. The phrasing reads like a direct institutional response to precisely the kind of event the London Burkers represented. 5.2 From Resurrectionism to Murder, the Career Path of John Bishop. The London group associated with the Burkers label, principally John Bishop, Thomas Williams, and James May, stood at the intersection of two eras, the older world of professional resurrectionists and the newer, more terrifying possibility of body supply via murder. Bishop, in particular, was widely described as an experienced resurrectionist before the murders came to light. This is historically important because it suggests that the move to homicide was not simply the innovation of desperate amateurs. It could be adopted by those already embedded in cadaver supply networks. Once grave robbing became more difficult and scrutiny intensified. The broader logic was straightforward. Conventional body snatching required digging, access to vulnerable burial grounds, the ability to evade guards, and a tolerance for mob violence if discovered. Murder, by contrast, required a controlled indoor space and a method of killing that avoided conspicuous injury, producing a corpse that could plausibly be described as a fresh subject, without obvious signs of violent death. Burke and Hare had demonstrated the model. London's group proved it could be replicated. In London, replication was not merely imitation. It was a sign that the cadaver market had become stable enough that suppliers could rationally invest in the most efficient procurement method. That stability is what most alarmed contemporaries and drove legislators toward reform. The crisis was no longer a matter of occasional grave violation but of an entrenched economy capable of escalating to murder. 5.3 The victim who made the scandal legible, Carlo Ferrari. The London Burkers case became publicly explosive in part because it involved victims whose disappearance could be narrated vividly in the press. The best known was Carlo Ferrari, a teenage Italian boy who worked in London as a street performer. When Ferrari vanished and his body was later connected to the murder ring, the story acquired an emotional clarity that made abstraction impossible. This was not a rumor of disturbed graves, nor a nameless pauper taken from a parish ground. It was a living childlike figure recognizable to the streets, a body converted into anatomy material. The details of the case circulated rapidly in pamphlets and newspapers, and were later preserved in compiled accounts and popular histories. While later retellings vary in texture and moral emphasis, they converge on the critical sequence. Ferrari was lured, killed, and his body offered for sale to anatomists, where suspicion finally broke through the normalized habits of looking away. In other words, the trade was stopped not by routine policing of grave robbery, but by an instance of murder that made deniability harder to sustain. This moment matters because it illustrates a persistent theme in the history of cadaver supply. Institutions often tolerate morally compromised procurement until a case becomes too visible, at which point reform becomes politically unavoidable. 5.4 King's College London and the failure of Don't Ask. A defining feature of the London Burkers crisis was that it unfolded around a prestigious anatomy setting, King's College London, rather than a marginal backroom buyer. In popular memory, the moment of exposure occurred when Bishop and his associates attempted to sell a particularly fresh body and the circumstances seemed wrong. The corpse looked too newly dead, lacked the ordinary traces of burial, and did not fit the expected profile of resurrectionist supply. Even without perfect agreement on every detail, the structural point is strong and historically useful. The system had functioned for years because the institutional buyer did not aggressively interrogate provenance. The London case ruptured that system because the body's condition and the surrounding story made indifference less defensible. The anatomy market's ordinary practices, nighttime deliveries, intermediaries, silence about origins, suddenly looked like complicity. The Anatomy Act that followed tried to solve precisely this problem by replacing informal procurement with licensed, inspectable channels. The Act established a system of registered practitioners and inspectors who could monitor where bodies were held and dissected, aiming to make the trade legible to the state rather than reliant on private discretion. 5.5 Panic, crowds, and the politics of anatomical space. Public reaction to the London Burkers revelation was intense. It did not remain confined to court proceedings or editorials. It moved into the streets, sometimes literally into the spaces of medical education. The anatomy school, previously a semi-private site where the dead were transformed into knowledge, became a focal point for anger and fear. Rumors spread rapidly that bodies were being procured through murder, that the poor were targeted, that hospitals and colleges were protected by status while ordinary people were defenseless. This pattern, crowds, protests, threats, even riots, had precedence in earlier body-snatching scares, but the London Burker scandal raised the temperature. Burke and Hare had already shown the extreme. London proved it could happen at the heart of the empire. In such a climate, the medical school became symbolically charged. It was not just a place of learning, it was imagined as the endpoint of a pipeline that began in the grave, or now in the murder room. The crisis therefore accelerated reform not simply because murder was shocking, murder was always shocking, but because it threatened social order. A system that provoked mobs and undermined trust in institutions was a governance problem. The state's later language, emphasizing regulation of anatomy to prevent crime, reflects that wider concern. 5.6 Trial, Conviction, and the Theatre of Criminal Justice. The prosecution and conviction of Bishop and at least one of his associates offered the public a familiar form of resolution, criminal justice theatre. Trials, verdicts, executions, these were legible rituals of state authority. They reassured audiences that the murderers would be punished. Yet, as with Burke and Hare, punishment did not erase the discomforting question, why did the market exist? This is a crucial interpretive point for the book. The London Burkers were condemned as monsters, yet the conditions that made their actions profitable remained: a strong educational demand for bodies, a limited legal supply, and a long-standing pattern of institutional willingness to accept corpses with minimal scrutiny. By focusing public rage on individual villains, the state could perform moral clarity while postponing structural reform. The crisis of 1831 made postponement impossible. 5.7 Why 1831 forced Parliament's hand. By the time of the London Burkers scandal, Parliament had already been moving toward a new settlement. The Select Committee on Anatomy, 1828, had gathered evidence that anatomical teaching required a larger supply than the law allowed and that criminal networks had filled the gap. The London murders did not create this knowledge, they transformed it into urgency. From a legislative perspective, the scandal clarified three realities. Enforcement alone could not solve the problem. Policing resurrectionists did not eliminate demand, it merely increased prices and incentives. The moral cost was escalating. Once murder entered the supply chain, the state faced not only sacrilege and disorder but a direct threat to life. Public trust in institutions was at risk. If citizens believed that hospitals and colleges were fed by murder, the legitimacy of those institutions could collapse. This is why the Anatomy Act's preamble reads as a response to a crisis, not merely a tidy reform. The law explicitly frames itself as necessary because insufficient legal supply had generated serious crimes, including lately murder, for the purpose of selling bodies. 5.8 The deeper shift, from graveyards to institutions. Another reason the London crisis mattered is that it helped normalize a new policy solution. Rather than trying to protect every grave, the state would change the source of bodies. The 1832 Act's framework, licensing, inspection, and regulated procurement, shifted anatomical supply away from churchyards toward institutions where the poor died in large numbers. London's role in this shift is significant because London was where institutional death and medical education were both concentrated. The metropolis had vast workhouses, hospitals, and charitable institutions, alongside a dense network of schools and lecturers. Once the state permitted lawful procurement through such institutions, it effectively redirected the supply chain into bureaucratic channels. The resurrectionist spade became less central than the workhouse ledger and the administrator's discretion. This change did not resolve ethical controversy, it reconfigured it. Grave robbery declined, but fears about the poor being used for dissection did not. They were, if anything, sharpened. The threat moved from the nighttime stranger to the institutional system itself. 5.9 Conclusion: The London Burkers as the final catalyst. The London Burkers scandal functioned as a final catalyst because it fused three anxieties into one event: the long-running fear of grave violation, the newer fear of murder for anatomical profit, and the political fear of disorder and institutional illegitimacy. In doing so, it helped make legislative reform both morally defensible and politically necessary. The Anatomy Act that followed did not simply end body snatching. It ended the previous arrangement, an uneasy coexistence in which medical schools benefited from resurrectionists while society tolerated the trade as an ugly necessity punctuated by periodic outrage. The London crisis made that coexistence untenable. The next chapter turns from scandal to structure, how the demand for bodies was embedded in medical education itself, and why dissection became the central educational practice that the state ultimately chose to protect, at a cost borne disproportionately by those with the least power in life and, increasingly, in death. 6. Medical education and the demand for cadavers. 6.1 Anatomy as the gateway science of the medical profession. By the late 18th century and into the 19th, British medicine underwent a decisive pedagogical shift. Anatomy was no longer treated as a gentlemanly supplement to book learning, but as the foundation of competent practice. This was not simply an intellectual change, it was an institutional one. Hospitals grew as sites of clinical instruction, private anatomy schools multiplied, and a rising professional culture increasingly expected that students would not merely hear anatomy described but would see it, and ideally, participate in dissection. In earlier modes of teaching, students might watch a professor demonstrate a body at the center of a lecture space while taking notes. By the 19th century, dissection was framed as an essential training ground for manual skill and diagnostic perception, especially for surgeons, whose professional identity depended on competence with the knife. A later educational framing captured the logic bluntly: skill on the dead subject was treated as the ethical prerequisite for intervening in the living. This argument, repeated in various forms by 19th-century surgical teachers, helped normalize dissection in the professional imagination even as it remained morally repugnant to large segments of the public. The demand for cadavers must be understood as the natural outcome of this teaching philosophy. If anatomy was essential, and if anatomy required bodies, then bodies became an educational necessity. Yet the law and public sentiment restricted lawful supply so severely that British medical education developed in permanent tension. It required what society was least willing to provide. 6.2 The private anatomy school: competition, reputation, and consumption of bodies. The scale of demand was amplified by the distinctive ecosystem of private anatomy schools, particularly in London. These schools competed for fee-paying students, and their reputations often rested on the promise of abundant anatomical material. In that competitive marketplace, bodies functioned as teaching capital. The more specimens a school could provide, the more attractive it became to students seeking practical experience. One of the most famous examples was the Great Windmill Street School, associated with William Hunter and later with his nephew Matthew Bailey. A historical account of the school traces its development to Hunter's anatomy lectures beginning in the mid-18th century, and shows how the school became a major site for anatomical instruction. Bailey inherited the premises and medical school connected with Hunter's estate and taught there for 2 decades, underscoring how anatomical teaching could operate as a semi-private enterprise rooted in personal networks and institutional property. This private school environment mattered for cadaver demand because it created multipliers. Each additional school needed bodies, each additional course required fresh subjects, each cohort of students expected hands-on access. Demand was therefore not a vague need, but something closer to an arithmetic. Dissection rooms were scheduled, teaching blocks planned, and bodies consumed accordingly. 6.3 Hospitals, professionalization, and the prestige economy of dissection. Alongside private schools, large hospitals increasingly became centers of teaching and surgical identity. Hospital-associated lecturers could draw students with the promise of clinical exposure, but anatomy remained the anchoring science that legitimized surgical authority. The relationship between hospitals and anatomy also shaped procurement. hospitals offered not only teaching venues but potential access to deaths within institutional walls, an issue that becomes crucial after 1832. The prestige economy of dissection also mattered. Skilled demonstrators, celebrated lecturers, and star surgeons drew crowds. The Royal College of Physicians Museum blog, for example, discusses Hunter's reputation as an exceptional teacher and evokes the crowded theatricality of the dissecting room, reflected in satirical prints of the era. These cultural traces are more than colorful detail. They show that anatomy teaching was public-facing enough to be caricatured, and profitable enough to foster competition, both of which increased pressure to secure bodies. 6.4 Why freshness mattered: decomposition, pedagogy, and market incentives. One reason the illicit trade remained so resilient is that medical teaching in this period strongly preferred fresh corpses. Modern preservation methods were limited. Embalming and long-term storage did not yet offer a simple substitute for the clarity of recently dead tissue. In practical terms, freshness affected what could be taught. Muscle planes were easier to display, organs more recognizable, and surgical techniques more realistically practiced. This preference turned cadaver supply into a race against time. Grave robbing could deliver fresh bodies, but only if resurrectionists operated quickly and efficiently. As shown in the surviving resurrectionist diary discussed earlier, body snatching had already become organized around speed and routine by the 1810s, indicating a supply system shaped by the educational value of freshness. The same freshness premium also helps explain why a shortage market could escalate from grave robbing to murder. If the highest prices were paid for bodies with minimal decomposition and minimal post-mortem damage, then suppliers were rewarded for any method that shortened the interval between death and delivery, an incentive structure that made the Burke and Hare model horrifyingly legible. 6.5 Student culture and the pedagogy of the hand. Dissection was not only a scientific exercise, it was a rite of passage. Students learned how to cut, separate, and identify structures, but they also learned a professional posture, emotional control, disciplined attention, and the ability to treat the corpse as educational material. This training had a moral dimension. Teachers frequently framed dissection as serving the living, an argument that provided ethical cover for practices that otherwise provoked visceral revulsion. The pedagogical shift from passive observation to active participation is repeatedly emphasized in discussions of 19th-century medical education. Earlier students often watched demonstrations, whereas later training increasingly expected students to engage directly, reflecting the rise of pathological anatomy and the belief that dissection was a primary source of medical knowledge. The more dissection became normal inside medical culture, the more intolerable the shortage became, because it threatened not merely convenience but the very credibility of training. 6.6 The 1828 Select Committee. Parliament confronts the anatomy economy. The cadaver crisis was not invisible to the state. The House of Commons Select Committee on Anatomy, 1828, explicitly investigated the manner of obtaining subjects for dissection and the law affecting those involved in obtaining and dissecting bodies. The committee's proceedings matter because they mark a transition in official understanding, from treating body snatching as episodic disorder to recognizing it as the predictable outcome of institutional demand colliding with legal scarcity. The committee's existence also underscores how deeply anatomy was embedded in professional training by this point. Parliament would not convene a major inquiry unless medical leaders could plausibly argue that anatomical study was vital to public welfare, safer surgery, better diagnosis, and improved medical competence. The state was therefore being asked to adjudicate between two public goods: respect for the dead and competence for the living. 6.7 Anatomy Act 1832, regulating education by regulating supply. When the Anatomy Act passed in 1832, it did not simply legalize dissection. It attempted to stabilize medical education by stabilizing the cadaver pipeline. The Act created a system of licensed teachers and inspectors of anatomy, and it permitted anatomical examination, where a person had lawful possession of a body provided no relative objected, an administrative mechanism intended to replace the clandestine market with regulated supply. Crucially, the law's own framing presented regulation as crime prevention. It stated that insufficient legal supply had produced serious crimes, including lately murder, committed to sell bodies for dissection. That preamble matters for interpreting the Act's educational impact. Parliament was explicitly choosing to protect medical training and public order by giving anatomy schools a legal route to bodies, even if that route would fall most heavily on those dying within institutions. 6.8 Demand after 1832. The problem changes shape rather than vanishing. A common misconception is that once the Anatomy Act passed, the demand problem was solved. In reality, the Act reorganized the supply system and reduced dependence on resurrectionists, but it did not eliminate pressures. Scholarly discussion of the Act and its aftermath has noted fluctuations in the number of bodies available to medical schools in the years after 1832, suggesting that legal reform did not produce a permanently abundant supply. For education, the consequence was twofold. Anatomy teaching became more securely institutionalized, protected by licensing and inspection. The moral controversy shifted from graveyards to institutions, especially workhouses and hospitals, where the unclaimed dead were most likely to be drawn into anatomical use. This is why Victorian medical education cannot be narrated simply as progress. It was progress achieved through a supply settlement that reallocated vulnerability, away from the graves of the respectable and toward the deaths of the poor. 6.9 Conclusion: Cadaver demand as a structural engine of the body trade. The demand for cadavers was not a side issue, it was the engine that drove every major development in this history: the professionalization of resurrectionists, the escalation to murder in extreme cases, and the eventual legislative restructuring of supply. The anatomy school, private or hospital-based, was the market center. As long as dissection was treated as essential to competence, bodies would be required in predictable numbers, at predictable times, and in conditions suitable for teaching. That predictability created profitability, and profitability created the incentive for supply, lawful or otherwise. The next chapter turns from demand to crisis again, how the panic generated by the London burkers and the wider scandals culminated in the 1832 legislation, and how that Act's promised reform produced new consequences that would shape Victorian death, poverty, and medicine for decades. 7. Social class and the politics of death. 7.1 Death as a social boundary in 19th century Britain. In Victorian Britain, death did not dissolve social difference, it often displayed it. Burial practices, funeral expenditure, memorial forms, and even the geography of the graveyard expressed class hierarchy in durable material ways. To be buried decently was not merely a religious act but a social one, an assertion of belonging, respectability, and family honor. The corpse was therefore not only a body, it was a symbol of a family's standing and of a community's moral order. Body snatching struck at this moral economy. Grave violation did not feel like property crime alone, it felt like a breach of the social contract that governed how the living related to the dead. The intensity of popular anger can only be understood within this framework. A community that could tolerate hunger, debt, and hardship might still erupt into riot over disturbed graves because burial was one of the few moments in which dignity could be asserted even by the poor. When resurrectionists stole bodies, especially from pauper graves, they did not merely take flesh, they took the last ritual claim that poverty could make. This is one reason why the later legislative settlement of 1832 remained ethically explosive. The Anatomy Act promised order and legality, but it did so by redirecting supply toward the institutional poor, those whose deaths were most likely to occur in spaces where bodies could be handled administratively rather than ritually. The result was a shift from the drama of graveyard theft to the quieter violence of bureaucratic acquisition. 7.2 The class geography of vulnerability, who could be taken, and why. Resurrectionists and later institutional procurement systems both depended on a basic asymmetry: some bodies were easier to acquire than others. In the grave robbing era, the easiest bodies were those buried in places with the least protection: overcrowded urban burial grounds, poorly staffed cemeteries, and graves associated with families unable to pay for security. In the post-1832 era, the easiest bodies were those that remained unclaimed within institutions, workhouses, hospitals, and similar establishments, where death occurred under administrative oversight and where kin networks were often fragile. In both cases, class shaped vulnerability through three mechanisms. Protection capacity: wealth could purchase better burial arrangements, stronger coffins, private plots, or in some regions, physical protective devices and paid guarding. Advocacy capacity: the respectable dead had families with social capital, employers, clergy, local influence, who could make disturbance costly. Visibility: the disappearance of the well-connected was more likely to trigger investigation, the disappearance of the marginal could be absorbed into the background noise of urban poverty. The result was an implicit selection system that aligned with class hierarchy even before the law formally redirected supply. The Anatomy Act did not create class bias out of nothing, it codified and stabilized a pattern the illicit market had already exploited. 7.3 The respectable corpse and the pauper corpse, two moral categories. Victorian society implicitly distinguished between bodies that were treated as inviolable and bodies that were treated as available. This distinction did not always map neatly onto income, but it mapped strongly onto respectability, stable family identity, clear parish belonging, recognizable social ties, and the capacity to stage a proper funeral. The respectable corpse was imagined as anchored within a community and guarded by social expectation. It deserved rituals, prayers, and undisturbed rest. The pauper corpse, by contrast, was imagined as a problem of management. It needed disposal, it required cost control, and it lacked the visible kinship structures that made disturbance scandalous. Even in charitable discourse, the poor were often described as a population that institutions must handle, rather than as individuals with equal claims to bodily dignity. This is why the Anatomy Act could be defended by reformers as rational and humane, while being experienced by working-class communities as predatory. For the medical reformer, unclaimed bodies were wasted educational resources that could serve the living. For the poor, unclaimed often meant something closer to dispossessed, the institutional dead whose families were too distant, too intimidated, too poor, or too socially powerless to assert their claims successfully. 7.4 Burial costs, pauper funerals, and the limits of family agency. Even when families wished to claim their dead, they were often constrained by money. Victorian funerals could be expensive relative to wages, and burial itself could involve fees for plots, clergy services, and basic rites. For those living at the edge of subsistence, the workhouse was not simply a place of life, it was a likely place of death, and the pauper funeral could be a humiliating endpoint, sparse, hurried, and stripped of the social statements that a respectable funeral made. This matters because dissection fears did not operate solely at the level of belief, they were entangled with economic reality. Poor families sometimes faced an impossible choice: claim the body and incur costs they could not bear, or allow the institution to handle disposal, at the risk that the body might become anatomically useful to others. Where legal frameworks treat claiming as a simple action, historical reality reveals it as a classed capacity. 7.5 Public disgust, religious anxiety, and the meaning of bodily integrity. Religious belief shaped attitudes toward post-mortem treatment, but it did so in complex ways. Not all opposition to dissection was strictly theological. Much of it was visceral and cultural: the horror of being cut, the fear of being displayed, the dread of the dead reduced to parts. Yet Christian frameworks of resurrection, bodily integrity, and proper burial rites provided a language for these fears, amplifying their force. The crucial point is that dissection was not culturally neutral. The Murder Act tradition had already linked dissection with punishment and disgrace, embedding the idea that being anatomized was a mark of infamy. When ordinary people feared dissection, they were not merely rejecting science, they were resisting the extension of a penal stigma into the realm of poverty. Under this moral logic, to be dissected was not simply to be used, it was to be dishonored. In working-class communities, these beliefs were often accompanied by a keen awareness of inequality. The dissection room was imagined as a space where the bodies of the poor served the ambitions of the educated, an image that resonated because it mirrored lived experience in other domains, from labor to law. 7.6 Protection as privilege, mort safes, watches, and class defense. The defensive measures that communities developed against body snatching also exposed inequality. Some protections required collective organization, night watches, community patrols, shared guarding duties. These were forms of popular solidarity, and they reveal how deeply communities valued the integrity of the dead. Yet other protections required money: heavy iron devices, locked vaults, elaborate coffins. Such measures were unevenly available. This unevenness mattered because it created a literal material expression of class difference in death. The wealthy could often buy peace. The poor had to work for it, guarding graves at night, taking turns in cold weather, relying on mutual vigilance. The very existence of such practices demonstrates that body snatching was widely understood as a realistic threat, and that state protection was perceived as insufficient. In the longer run, the same logic would carry into the post-1832 era. Protection from anatomical appropriation became, in many cases, a function of social position. The more secure one's social ties and resources, the less likely one was to be treated as available after death. 7.7 Dissection and the politics of consent, what objection could mean in practice. Legal reform attempted to introduce safeguards, most notably, the idea that relatives could object. Yet the politics of objection are inseparable from class. Objection is not simply a moral stance, it is an action that requires access, confidence, and institutional navigational skill. To object effectively, relatives needed to know a death had occurred, arrive in time, understand their rights, and be taken seriously by officials. These were not evenly distributed capacities. The wealthy, the literate, and the socially confident were better positioned to assert claims. The poor, especially those already stigmatized by the workhouse system, often faced barriers that turned rights into abstractions. This is where Victorian class politics enters the anatomy story at its most intense. The system could be defended as lawful and procedurally fair, yet still operate in a way that consistently extracted bodies from the same social groups. That is precisely the pattern that later historians have described as the transformation of dissection into a de facto consequence of poverty. 7.8 The moral economy of medicine, progress funded by inequality. Medical reformers frequently justified dissection by invoking the public good, better knowledge, improved surgery, reduced suffering. This argument carried real force. Modern medicine did benefit from anatomical study. Yet the distribution of that benefit and the distribution of its burdens were not the same. The poor supplied bodies, the professional classes acquired training and status, the broader population eventually benefited unevenly from improved medical practice. This asymmetry helps explain why dissection remained culturally charged long after legislative reform. The poor were being asked to pay in death for a medical system that often failed them in life. Workhouse infirmaries were frequently under-resourced, and the experience of poverty itself was shaped by state coercion. In that context, the use of pauper bodies for education could feel like one more extraction, another way in which the poor were turned into resources. The politics of death, therefore, became the politics of medicine. Opposition to dissection was not always opposition to knowledge, it was often opposition to the terms on which knowledge was being produced. 7.9 Cultural memory and class trauma, why the fear endured. The fear of body snatching persisted in popular memory because it attached to a deeper truth about power: some bodies mattered more than others. Even when grave robbing declined, the fear could remain because the underlying inequality did not. Folklore, cautionary tales, and community warnings continued to circulate in part because they made sense within a lived reality of precariousness. Victorian literature would later draw on this cultural reservoir, converting class anxieties into narrative motifs: the poor threatened by institutions, the dead denied peace, the medical man as both healer and violator. These cultural representations did not invent the fear, they gave it form and longevity. 7.10 Conclusion: class as the hidden structure of the body trade. Social class was not a background condition of the body trade, it was one of its organizing principles. Resurrectionists targeted the graves of those least able to protect them. Legislative reform later targeted the institutional dead, a population disproportionately composed of the poor. In both cases, the bodies most likely to be turned into anatomical subjects were the bodies least protected by wealth, status, and advocates. This chapter's argument is therefore structural. The history of grave robbing and anatomical procurement cannot be told solely as a story of criminals, reformers, and laws. It must also be told as a history of who possessed the power to secure dignity in death, and who did not. The next chapter turns to resistance, the strategies communities used to defend burial grounds, the devices and patrols that emerged, and the escalating arms race between resurrectionists and the living who refused to allow their dead to become commodities. 8. Public resistance and protective measures. 8.1a Defensive culture forms. The dead must be kept. Body snatching did not merely provoke fear, it provoked organization. Across Britain, especially in cities with active anatomy schools and in rural districts where a single violation could shake an entire parish, communities developed a defensive culture aimed at one central objective: to preserve the dead long enough for decomposition to make them worthless to anatomists. The trade's practical dependence on fresh bodies meant that protection did not need to be permanent. Families and communities needed to hold the line for days or weeks, long enough for the corpse to pass beyond the market's preferred condition. This temporal logic shaped the entire arsenal of protective measures. Strategies were designed to delay, deter, or expose resurrectionists during the short window when a newly buried body was most valuable. The result was a grim arms race between professional body snatchers and ordinary people determined to protect burial integrity. 8.2 Watching the grave, vigil, patrol, and the social labor of mourning. One of the most widespread responses to body snatching was also the simplest: guarding the grave. Families and neighbors kept night vigils, taking turns in shifts, often for several nights after burial. In some areas, this vigilance became formalized through community watching societies, subscription-based associations that funded patrols and coordination. These groups were particularly significant in Scotland, where collective strategies became an important counterweight to resurrectionist activity. Guarding a grave was more than a practical act. It was a public performance of care, a declaration that the dead belonged to a community and would not be surrendered to strangers. It also transformed mourning into labor. The living, especially working people, paid a price in exhaustion and risk, spending cold nights in churchyards to protect bodies that wealthier families might defend through locks, vaults, or paid guards. The material evidence of this defensive culture survives in the architecture of graveyards. Watch houses and shelters were erected in some churchyards to accommodate watchers. Later local histories often note that by the late 19th century these buildings were no longer necessary, implying their origin in an earlier period of intense concern about body snatching. 8.3 Watch houses, kirk sessions, and the built environment of fear. In regions where vigil keeping became routine, churchyards acquired structures designed for surveillance and shelter. Watch houses could be simple huts or more elaborate buildings with windows and vantage points. In some places, existing parish buildings were repurposed, kirk session houses used as bases for watchers, turning ecclesiastical infrastructure into a defensive network. This built environment illustrates how deeply body snatching penetrated everyday life. Burial grounds were not only sacred spaces, they became contested spaces requiring oversight, schedules, and sometimes quasi-military coordination. The existence of such structures also underscores that public resistance was not merely emotional, it was sustained, practical, and spatially embedded. 8.4 The Mortsafe, Iron Technology against the Resurrectionists. The most iconic Victorian-era anti-body snatching device was the mortsafe, also called a mortcage, a heavy iron contraption placed over a fresh grave to prevent access to the coffin. Mortsafes were particularly associated with Scotland and northern Britain, where resurrectionist activity and public countermeasures were exceptionally well developed. A typical mortsafe was designed to be temporary, installed for a period, often discussed as several weeks, until decomposition reduced the body's value, then removed and reused. Two features of the mortsafe are historically revealing. It was reusable, which made it economically viable for communities. Churchyards sometimes owned mortsafes and hired them out, and in some district societies formed to purchase and control them via membership fees. It was explicitly time-bound, reflecting the market's dependence on freshness. The point was not to protect forever, but to block access during the danger window. The mortsafe also makes visible the class politics of protection. Wealthier families could secure graves through vaults, mausoleums, and heavy monuments. Mortsafes and subscription societies represent an attempt by less wealthy communities to build collective protection where private wealth was insufficient. 8.5 Morthouses and public vaults, delaying burial to defeat the market. A related strategy was to avoid immediate burial altogether. Some communities constructed vaults or morthouses, public receiving houses for the dead, where coffins could be stored until the body was no longer desirable to resurrectionists. The logic was again temporal. If the corpse could be kept behind thick doors, locks, and communal oversight during the early post-mortem period, then burial could occur later with reduced risk. This approach had a particular appeal in areas where graves were hard to protect but buildings could be secured. It also offered a solution when winter conditions, distance, or fear made repeated grave watching impractical. The very existence of public vault systems demonstrates that body snatching was not perceived as an occasional oddity. It was treated as a sufficiently regular threat to justify communal capital investment and ongoing maintenance. 8.6 Coffin design and the quiet industrialization of security burial. Beyond large external devices, some families pursued protection through coffin construction, heavier materials, stronger lids, extra nails, locked fittings. While the evidence for specific anti-resurrectionist coffin designs varies by region and by the extent to which later accounts romanticize the ingenuity of the past, the general principle is historically solid. Burial practices responded to threat. Coffins were not only funerary objects, they were, increasingly, defensive containers. The social meaning of these modifications is important. A secure coffin was a way of purchasing peace in the face of uncertainty, turning fear into a commodity. Yet, again, security burial often required money. The poor were pushed toward collective strategies, watching societies, shared mortsafes, or toward simply enduring the anxiety of vulnerability. 8.7 Booby traps, and the technological imagination of deterrence. Victorian public discourse often blurred the line between what was common practice and what was imagined, proposed, or patented. Few examples capture this better than the notorious concept of the coffin torpedo, a weaponized device intended to injure or kill anyone who attempted to open a coffin illicitly. The best documented coffin torpedo patents are actually American, late 19th century, but they became part of a wider transatlantic lore of anti-grave robbing invention. An 1878 patent by Philip K. Clover is frequently cited as an early example, a device mounted inside a coffin designed to fire when the lid was pried open, explicitly marketed as preventing the unauthorized resurrection of dead bodies. For this manuscript's purposes, coffin torpedoes matter less as evidence of widespread deployment and more as evidence of cultural imagination. They reveal a world in which people felt so threatened by grave violation that lethal mechanical deterrence could be framed as reasonable. Even if rarely used, the very concept speaks to the depth of anxiety and the sense that official protection was inadequate. 8.8 Detection Tactics: Flowers, Stones, and the Forensic Eye of the Poor. Not all protective measures were expensive or technological. Some were low-cost detection practices, placing stones, shells, or patterned arrangements on grave surfaces so that any disturbance could be noticed immediately. Such methods were particularly important for the poor, who could not afford iron cages or vaults but could build a simple alarm system through careful observation. In this way, protection could be crafted from attention and communal knowledge rather than from purchased materials. These practices also illustrate a wider theme. Resistance was often about visibility. Resurrectionists depended on stealth and deniability. Communities responded by making disturbance legible and socially costly. 8.9 Violence, Deterrence, and the Limits of Community Defense. Public resistance sometimes escalated into direct violence against suspected body snatchers. This violence can be read as moral outrage, but also as a rational response to limited legal remedy. Where the law struggled to treat corpse theft as theft in the ordinary property sense, and where prosecutions were uneven, communities filled the enforcement vacuum with collective punishment. This created a feedback loop. Increased violence made body snatching more dangerous, encouraging resurrectionists to become more organized and secretive. More organization made them harder to catch, encouraging communities to intensify patrols and protective investment. The escalation thus reinforced the sense of living in a contested moral landscape. The dead required guarding, and the graveyard became a site of nightly conflict. 8.10 How resistance shaped reform. The state seeks a quieter solution. Public countermeasures did not eliminate the supply problem, they raised its costs. Rising costs increased the price of bodies, and higher prices intensified incentives. One reason scarcity markets can spiral toward extreme procurement methods, including murder. This dynamic is exactly what Parliament later claimed to be responding to when it framed the Anatomy Act as a measure to regulate anatomical study because insufficient legal supply had produced serious crimes. The Anatomy Act attempted to end the graveyard war by shifting supply into regulated channels, licensed anatomists, inspectors, and access to bodies held under lawful possession, particularly within institutions. In this sense, public resistance worked, not by stopping anatomy, but by making grave robbery socially and politically unsustainable. Yet the price of this settlement would be paid elsewhere, as later chapters show, in the workhouse system and the institutional dead. 8.11 Conclusion: Protecting the Dead as Social History. Victorian resistance to body snatching was not a footnote to medical progress, it was a major social movement expressed through everyday practice. People built iron cages, formed watching societies, guarded graves through the night, and imagined lethal deterrence because they experienced grave violation as a profound injustice, often classed, often humiliating, always intimate. The protective measures documented here illuminate three key realities. Body snatching was widespread enough to generate durable defensive infrastructure. Protection was unevenly distributed, exposing class inequality even in death. Resistance helped push the state toward legislative reform that replaced the graveyard conflict with a bureaucratic system, one that would transform the politics of death rather than ending it. The next chapter turns to that legal transformation itself, the Anatomy Act of 1832, how it was framed, how it operated, and how its consequences reshaped cadaver procurement in Victorian Britain. 9. The Anatomy Act 1832, Legislative Reform and its Consequences. 9.1 Reform as Crisis Management, not Moral Consensus. The Anatomy Act of 1832 is often described, especially in simplified narratives, as the moment Britain solved the body snatching problem. In truth, it was a crisis management statute, an attempt to stabilize medical education and restore public order after a period in which grave robbery had become systematic and, in the most notorious cases, had escalated into murder for anatomical profit. Parliament made this linkage explicit. The Act's preamble states that the legal supply of human bodies for anatomical examination was insufficient and that, as a result, great and grievous crimes had been committed, including lately murder, for the purpose of selling bodies to anatomists. That framing is central. The law positioned itself as a response to a market failure with violent consequences. It is crucial to note what this means for interpretation. The Act did not arise from a sudden cultural acceptance of dissection. It arose from the political recognition that the existing arrangement, anatomy schools quietly buying bodies while communities defended graves, had become intolerably unstable. Reform was aimed as much at preventing riots and scandals as at ensuring ethical procurement. 9.2 The Act's core bargain: regulate anatomy by expanding lawful supply. The Anatomy Act's practical logic was straightforward. If illegal suppliers existed because legal supply was too small, then the state could reduce illegal supply by expanding lawful sources and by regulating who could receive and dissect bodies. The Act therefore created a framework intended to replace resurrectionists and intermediaries with licensed practitioners and oversight mechanisms. In broad terms, the Act did three things: authorized anatomical examination under defined conditions, shifting dissection from an exceptional scandal-prone practice into a normalized part of medical training; created a licensing and inspection regime to make anatomy legible to the state and less reliant on private arrangements; redirected cadaver supply toward bodies that could be obtained without grave violation, especially bodies held under lawful possession where no relatives objected. Modern summaries correctly identify these as the Act's key features, including licensing and inspectors of anatomy. Yet the apparent neutrality of these mechanisms concealed a socially explosive reality. The bodies most likely to be available under lawful possession and to remain unclaimed were overwhelmingly the bodies of the institutional poor. 9.3 Lawful possession and the administrative capture of the dead. One of the most consequential concepts in the Act was lawful possession. It allowed certain custodians, especially institutional authorities, to transfer bodies for anatomical examination under regulated circumstances. In theory, this was meant to prevent the criminality of grave robbery and the terror of murder markets by ensuring that bodies entered anatomy through authorized channels. In practice, lawful possession functioned as an administrative lever. Workhouses, hospitals, and prisons were spaces where the dead could be turned into paperwork, logged, stored, transferred. The corpse became an object within a governance system rather than a member of a community protected by ritual. This shift did not require that officials be cruel. It required only that institutions already held power over the poor. Once the law formalized a pathway from institutional custody to dissection rooms, the cadaver supply chain could be routinized. This is why, in popular perception, the Act did not abolish fear. It relocated it. The threat was no longer primarily the resurrectionist in the churchyard. It was the institution. 9.4 The objection principle and the unequal capacity to refuse. The Act included mechanisms often discussed as safeguards, most notably the idea that bodies could be used where there was no known objection by relatives. This is sometimes characterized as an early form of consent framework, though it is more accurate to describe it as a non-objection model, operating in a context where many deaths occurred among people with weak or disrupted kin networks. Even if we treat the objection mechanism as meaningful in principle, its practical operation was classed. To object effectively, a family needed timely knowledge of the death, physical access to the institution, confidence and literacy to assert rights, and social authority to be taken seriously. These capacities were unevenly distributed. The middle classes were better positioned to object, the poor were more likely to be delayed, intimidated, absent, or socially discounted. Thus, a formal safeguard could coexist with systematic extraction from the same social strata, because safeguards that rely on action are only as strong as the ability to act. 9.5 Licensing and inspectors, bureaucracy as legitimacy. The Act also established a professional administrative structure, licensed anatomists and inspectors tasked with oversight. This mattered not only legally but culturally. Victorian governance increasingly relied on inspection regimes, public health, factories, poor law administration, as a way to claim legitimacy through bureaucratic visibility. Anatomy was brought into that administrative world. The intended effects were to reduce the market for illegally obtained bodies, to ensure that anatomical practice occurred in accountable venues, and to reassure the public that the state had replaced a black market with regulated order. In one sense, this worked. Grave robbery declined because the economic incentive weakened. But regulation did not erase public distrust, because the public did not only fear criminality, they feared dissection itself, and they feared its class distribution. 9.6 Immediate consequences: riots, rumors, and contested legitimacy. One of the Act's most revealing features is that it did not produce calm. Instead, it provoked resistance, particularly in working-class communities and in places where institutional deaths were most visible. Rumors spread that workhouses were selling bodies. Communities suspected that the poor were being harvested. These fears were not irrational in the context of Victorian poverty governance. Workhouses already represented coercion and humiliation. To imagine them as pipeline sources for dissection was to see them as extending that coercion beyond the grave. The law's preamble had framed reform as a response to crime and murder. Many working people experienced it as a shift in target, from graveyards in general to pauper bodies in particular. The conflict therefore became less about whether anatomy should exist and more about who would pay for its existence. 9.7 Ending resurrectionism, preserving inequality. The Act succeeded in its immediate political aim. It made the old resurrectionist supply chain less necessary and less profitable. If licensed teachers could acquire bodies through legal channels, the incentive to raid graves declined. In this sense, the graveyard war eased. But the deeper inequality of the system was not eliminated, it was stabilized. The old illicit market had already been class-skewed. Resurrectionists targeted the vulnerable because they were easiest to take. The Act turned that pattern into administrative routine. It replaced nighttime violation with daytime paperwork and institutional custody. This shift helps explain the enduring historical argument that the Anatomy Act made dissection functionally a punishment for poverty. Even without treating dissection as formally punitive, the system ensured that the most exposed bodies were those of the destitute and unclaimed. 9.8 The Act is a pivot point in the Victorian moral imagination. Culturally, the Anatomy Act marked a pivot in how Victorian Britain imagined the relationship between medicine and society. Before 1832, the scandal centre was the cemetery, the violated grave, the disturbed coffin, the stolen dead. After 1832, the scandal centre increasingly became the institution, the workhouse deadhouse, the hospital morgue, the administrative transfer. This change reshaped narrative, rumor, and literature. Fear moved from the dramatic figure of the resurrectionist to the colder spectre of bureaucratic extraction. It also changed the moral language of protest. People began to speak less about thieves in the night and more about systemic injustice, the idea that the poor were being used without consent, while the wealthy remained protected by resources and family claims. 9.9 Long-term consequences: professional power and public trust. Over the long term, the Act helped consolidate professional medical authority. By stabilizing anatomical teaching, it supported the training that made Victorian surgery more competent and eventually less deadly. It also gave anatomy a legal footing that legitimized it as a state-protected practice rather than a semi-illicit necessity. Yet the cost was public trust, especially among the poor. When a medical system is perceived as feeding on the bodies of the powerless, it does not simply create ethical controversy, it creates suspicion toward hospitals, doctors, and institutions of care. That suspicion could influence patterns of hospital avoidance, resistance to poor law medical provision, and broader distrust of state governance. This is not merely an ethical observation, it is a historical mechanism. Public trust is itself an ingredient in public health. Victorian reforms often advanced medicine while simultaneously generating mistrust among those most subject to institutional control. The Anatomy Act is one of the clearest examples of this double movement: progress for medical training, resentment for the governed poor. 9.10 Conclusion: what the Anatomy Act solved, and what it created. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was a watershed, but not because it made the body supply problem disappear. It ended one unstable arrangement, resurrectionist procurement from graves, and replaced it with a regulated system designed to protect medical education and reduce crime. Parliament explicitly framed the reform as necessary because shortages had produced great and grievous crimes, and lately murder. Yet the Act also created a new settlement whose moral burden fell disproportionately on the institutional poor. It shifted vulnerability from the cemetery to the workhouse, it replaced the spade with the ledger, and it transformed the politics of death into a politics of administration. The next chapter follows this new system into the heart of Victorian poverty governance, the workhouse. There the Act's consequences became fully visible, as the trade in bodies, now legal, regulated and bureaucratically managed, intertwined with the machinery of the new poor law and the lived experience of destitution. 10. The Victorian workhouse system and the trade in pauper bodies. 10.1 From graveyards to institutions, the new geography of procurement. The Anatomy Act of 1832 sought to end the graveyard war by making cadaver supply administratively attainable. Its preamble makes the state's objective unmistakable. Anatomical examination was necessary for medical knowledge, legal supply was insufficient, and great and grievous crimes, and lately murder had been committed to sell bodies, therefore the state would give protection, under certain regulations, to the study and practice of anatomy. The practical consequence was a shift in the geography of vulnerability. Where resurrectionists had targeted the least protected graves, the legal regime increasingly drew bodies from the places where the poorest died under custodial authority, workhouses, charitable hospitals, and similar institutions. This redirection was intensified by the New Poor Law, 1834, and the expansion of the workhouse system. Although the Anatomy Act did not mention workhouses alone, the workhouse was uniquely positioned to become a primary supplier. It concentrated the destitute, created new bureaucratic routines for death management, and placed the dead within a chain of lawful custody that could be translated into anatomical transfer. As modern historical scholarship has emphasized, Victorian medical education's expansion was underpinned by body trafficking networks in the dead poor, a system that became more regular and data visible after the Poor Law reforms. 10.2 The workhouse deadhouse, death managed as routine. Victorian workhouses were not designed as hospitals, but illness and death were unavoidable features of confinement, especially for the aged poor and those with chronic disease. Workhouse administration treated death as a logistical problem. The body must be recorded, stored briefly, disposed of cheaply, and removed efficiently. Within that logic, the deadhouse or mortuary space became a node where a corpse could pass from person to case, and from case to specimen. Under the Anatomy Act, institutions could dispose of bodies that were not claimed within a short period, and while procedures and local practice varied, the key point was that institutional custody made bodies legible to administrators and transferable to medical schools. Popular history summaries of workhouse practice note that under the 1832 Act, bodies unclaimed after a brief interval could be donated for medical training, an option available across institutions, but one that became particularly significant in workhouse settings because so many inmates lacked family able, or willing, to claim them. The moral significance of this shift cannot be overstated. The Victorian poor had long feared the resurrectionist, the post-1832 poor increasingly feared the institution itself. In public imagination, the workhouse became a place where the living were coerced and the dead were at risk of being converted into anatomy material through paperwork rather than theft. 10.3 Unclaimed does not mean unloved, how poverty breaks kinship power. The Act's administrative language relied on an apparently neutral category, bodies without effective objection or claim. Yet in practice, unclaimed often reflected not indifference but constraint. Families might be distant, estranged by migration, frightened by authorities, or financially unable to manage burial expenses. The workhouse also fragmented kinship power by institutional design. It separated families, disciplined dependents, and reduced the poor's ability to act collectively. As scholarship on Victorian dissection fear argues, the horror of dissection was inseparable from the poor person's experience of cumulative deprivation, loss of belongings, humiliation, and the dread that even the body would be taken after death. This is why the Anatomy Act's objection principle did not guarantee meaningful protection for the destitute. Objection requires notice, access, confidence, and institutional responsiveness. Those capacities were unevenly distributed. The poor could be unclaimed, not because no one cared, but because poverty reduced the practical force of care. 10.4 Guardians, incentives, and the political economy of pauper corpses. Once workhouses became routine sources of anatomical material, a political economy developed around the dead. Medical schools required bodies, institutions bore the costs of pauper burial, transfers could reduce burial expenditure and in some contexts, introduce financial compensation or cost offsets, sometimes indirectly, through paid burials performed by anatomy providers. Even when direct payment was officially controversial, the system still produced incentives: fewer burial costs, less administrative burden, and smoother institutional functioning. This is where the Victorian trade in pauper bodies can be understood as a network, not a conspiracy. It involved guardians, workhouse masters, porters, undertakers, transport arrangements, and receiving anatomy departments. Hearn's work, in particular, has framed this as a widespread infrastructure supporting medical education through the dead poor, recovering case histories and showing how a commodified corpse could travel from a poor law district into a dissecting room and then into an anatomy burial. The system's routinization mattered. When procurement becomes routine, moral shock diminishes inside institutions even as resentment grows outside them. A transfer that looks like an entry in a ledger can feel, to communities, like the quiet continuation of the old body trade, only now sheltered by law. 10.5 Inspectors of Anatomy, oversight that could not erase class bias. The Anatomy Act attempted to legitimize procurement through licensing and inspection. In theory, inspectors were the state's answer to secrecy. They would ensure that bodies were obtained through lawful channels and that anatomical practice was monitored. In practice, inspection could reduce overt illegality without confronting the ethical distribution of burden. A major doctoral study of East Anglia's implementation reassesses how the Act worked on the ground and highlights the ongoing centrality of acquiring corpses for medical education, exactly the pressure that pulled institutions into supply relationships. Oversight also produced new kinds of conflict, disputes over rightful custody, tensions between local guardians and anatomy departments, and the moral discomfort of officials asked to treat dead paupers as public resources. Inspection could make a system orderly, but it could not make it socially equal. 10.6 Case Study Lens, Pauper Dead Houses and Regional Trafficking Routes. By the late Victorian period, the workhouse supply system did not remain purely local. Bodies could be moved across districts toward expanding university departments and teaching schools. Hearn's article on Cambridge's Anatomical Teaching School explicitly frames the institution as a regional leader in training from about 1870 to 1914 and uses it as a case study to illuminate trafficking methods and central, local relations. The article's opening, in accessible versions, signals that local newspapers could even frame the system as a shadow of a scandal, indicating that public suspicion persisted well into the period when procurement was supposedly settled by law. This regionalization is historically important. It shows that the Anatomy Act did not merely replace grave robbing with local institutional donation. It enabled the creation of a broader distribution network linking poor law districts to teaching centers, an infrastructure that could function with minimal public visibility, precisely because it occurred within bureaucratic channels rather than in violated churchyards. 10.7 Public suspicion and the persistence of body trade language. Despite legality, popular language often continued to frame the system as a trade. That word carried the memory of resurrectionists and the sense that bodies were being converted into value for others. Public suspicion was fed by several factors. The enduring cultural stigma of dissection, still associated with indignity. The class pattern of procurement, the poor supplied disproportionately, and institutional secrecy. Even regulated systems often operated quietly to avoid provoking crowds. Later commentary on the Act's aftermath notes that mobs and protests continued into the 1840s because people believed it failed to prevent the sale or appropriation of paupers' bodies without meaningful consent. Even when these beliefs were partly shaped by rumor, they were grounded in a structural truth. The new system protected the graves of the respectable far more effectively than it protected the post-mortem autonomy of the destitute. 10.8 The workhouse as a pipeline, why this became the Victorian norm. By the later 19th century, several trends reinforced the workhouse pipeline. The expansion of medical education increased steady demand for teaching cadavers. Poor law institutions concentrated the most socially isolated deaths. The Act's legal architecture made institutional transfer easier than graveyard procurement. Oversight focused on legality and procedure more than distributive justice. The result was a grim Victorian settlement. Anatomy could be taught more reliably and with less open criminality, but the bodies that sustained that reliability were disproportionately the bodies of those whose lives had already been shaped by coercive poverty governance. 10.9 Conclusion. Dissection becomes an afterlife of destitution. The workhouse did not invent the vulnerability of the poor in death, but it mechanized it. Under the old regime, pauper graves were raided because they were easier to raid. Under the new regime, pauper bodies were transferred because they were easier to transfer, held under lawful custody, less likely to be claimed, and processed through administrative routines designed to minimize cost. The Anatomy Act framed itself as protection against crime and murder, but its operational consequence was the creation of a legal supply chain that converted institutional death into educational material. This is why Victorian debates about anatomy were never simply debates about science. They were debates about whose bodies the state could treat as resources, whose deaths could be turned into instruction, and whether social progress could be justified when its most intimate costs were borne by the powerless. 11. Colonial contexts, grave robbing and the appropriation of human remains in the British Empire. 11.1 Exporting a shortage, anatomy's imperial demand problem. The British cadaver crisis was not confined to Britain. As medical education expanded across the British Empire, through colonial hospitals, emerging universities, and military medical systems, colonies encountered the same structural contradiction that had fueled resurrectionism at home. Anatomical teaching demanded bodies, while public sentiment and existing law often restricted lawful supply. In many colonies, this contradiction was intensified by smaller populations, fewer executed criminals available under older punishment regimes, and less stable or less formalized administrative oversight. Yet colonial contexts were not simply Britain, but elsewhere. The imperial environment introduced new power relations and new moral logics, particularly regarding indigenous peoples. Where British reform debates often pivoted on class, pauper bodies versus respectable bodies, colonial debates frequently pivoted on race, sovereignty, and the dehumanizing language of specimen collecting. In this sense, the empire did not merely reproduce Britain's cadaver politics, it often amplified them. 11.2 Settler colonies and the institutionalization of specimen thinking. In settler colonies such as Australia, and especially in Tasmania, Victoria, and New South Wales, European scientific and medical cultures developed alongside an intense 19th-century interest in human classification, phrenology, comparative anatomy, racial morphology, fields that treated bodies and skeletal remains as evidence for hierarchies rather than as remains requiring equal respect. This intellectual climate encouraged what can be described as specimen thinking, the transformation of human remains into objects of study, status, and institutional prestige. One of the clearest ways to trace this is through the historical record of museum and institutional collecting. Paul Turnbull's work on Aboriginal remains is repeatedly cited in Australian historiography for examining how body snatching and remains collection fed scientific ambitions and national identity projects in 19th-century Australia. Even basic bibliographic records underline that his study explicitly addresses Aboriginal body snatching and its entanglement with scientific and institutional agendas. In other words, colonial anatomy and anthropology could operate within a moral universe where the indigenous dead were imagined as resources for European knowledge-making, often without consent, sometimes through direct theft, and frequently through coercive custody in institutions. 11.3 The colonial state and permissive regulatory space. Colonial governments were often eager to build modern institutions, hospitals, universities, museums, capable of signaling progress and legitimacy. In practice, this ambition could create permissive environments for anatomical procurement, particularly when colonial elites framed dissection and collecting as markers of civilization. The key distinction here is not simply that colonies had different laws, it is that the cost of violation was often different. In Britain, grave robbing scandals could provoke mass protest and parliamentary scrutiny. In colonial settings, especially those defined by indigenous dispossession, the people most at risk of bodily appropriation were often those least able to mobilize legal protection, public outrage, or political leverage. This is not to suggest colonial publics never objected, many did, especially when fears extended to settlers themselves. But the asymmetry of power meant that some bodies were far more available than others. 11.4 Tasmania 1869, William Lann and the scandal that revealed colonial anatomy's reach. No case better illustrates the colonial entanglement of anatomy, racial science, and institutional power than the 1869 mutilation of the body of William Lann, also widely spelled Lanny, often described in colonial discourse as the last Tasmanian Aboriginal man. A major scholarly account in Social History of Medicine explains that in 1869 two British trained surgeons in Hobart Town's General Hospital, William Crowther and George Stokel, engaged in a serial quest to obtain Lann's skeleton. It states that Crowther stole Lann's skull from beneath his skin with the intention of sending it to the Hunterian Museum in London, while Stokel later resurrected the body from its grave on behalf of the local Royal Society's museum. The article emphasizes the political shock this produced. A subsequent inquiry revealed how readily Tasmanians might be turned into subjects for dissection, prompting regulatory action. The same basic narrative appears in the University of Melbourne's repository record describing the event as a scandal that precipitated legal regulation, including the detail that Crowther intended to ship the skull to London and that Stokell removed the body from its grave. Additional Australian scholarship provides further specificity about the mutilations and the contested memory of the event. An ANU-hosted article on the mutilation of William Lann in 1869 describes competing scientists seeking the skeleton, noting Crowther's removal of the head and subsequent removals attributed to others. A modern ABC explainer likewise anchors the key timeline, Lann's death on March 3, 1869, and frames the incident as a continuing moral and political issue in Tasmania. Why does this matter for a history of grave robbing? Because it shows that the body trade logic, treating remains as a commodity of institutional prestige, extended beyond the classroom into museum science and imperial networks of collection. It also demonstrates that colonial scandals could produce legislation not only to regulate the dead poor, as in Britain, but to manage public fear that anyone might be appropriated by ambitious medical men. 11.5 From London to Hobart, Imperial Circuits of Prestige and the Lure of Metropole Institutions. A striking element of the Lann case is the imagined endpoint, the Hunterian Museum in London. This reveals an imperial circuit of scientific prestige. Colonial surgeons could elevate their status by sending rare or valuable remains to metropole institutions, thereby connecting themselves to the center of scientific authority. In this prestige economy, indigenous remains were not treated as individuals with communities and rights, they were treated as objects that could purchase recognition. Libraries Tasmania's description of the Crowther collection explicitly links 19th-century European practices of taking bodies, without the knowledge or permission of their families, to Crowther's orchestration of mutilation in 1869, while Lann lay in the hospital morgue. The institutional framing here is important. It shows how the practice sat within a broader history of collecting and display, rather than being an isolated personal aberration. 11.6 Colonial legislation, anatomy acts, inquiries, and fear of settler vulnerability. Colonial responses to procurement controversies often took legislative form. In Tasmania, later legal consolidation documents explicitly refer to an Anatomy Act 1869 that was eventually repealed by a 1964 consolidation statute, evidence that colonial authorities did establish a statutory framework governing anatomical practice. Even contemporary parliamentary reporting from 1869 reflects the colony's legislative attention to regulating anatomy practice, including provisions around legal practitioners' access to dead houses and dissecting rooms and administrative authority involved in oversight. This legislative trail helps make a key interpretive point. Colonial regulation was not driven only by humanitarian concern for indigenous people, though those concerns are essential in modern ethical appraisal. It was also driven by settler fear that the same institutional power used against indigenous bodies could be used against settlers, and fear that medical men could appropriate bodies at will. That is exactly the anxiety highlighted in the social history of medicine account of the Tasmanian Inquiry. 11.7 Beyond Australia, Empire-wide patterns of coercive acquisition. While Australia provides a particularly clear case study, similar dynamics operated elsewhere in the empire. Military and hospital systems created concentrated institutional death, enabling procurement through custody. Racial science encouraged collecting, measuring, and classifying indigenous remains across colonial territories. Weaker local protections and limited political power among colonized populations increased vulnerability to remains theft. The specifics differ by region and require careful local archival work to avoid overgeneralization. But the structural pattern is consistent, where bodies carried scientific prestige and local groups lacked enforceable rights over their dead, extraction followed. 11.8 Colonialism's distinctive moral economy, class exploitation plus racial dehumanization. It is tempting to describe colonial body appropriation as simply a continuation of the British exploitation of the poor. The better historical framing is additive. Colonial contexts often combined Britain's class-based vulnerabilities with racialized dehumanization. In Britain, the poor were vulnerable because institutions held them and because their kinship claims were fragile. In colonies, indigenous people were often vulnerable not only through poverty or custody, but through the settler state's denial of sovereignty and the scientific reduction of indigenous bodies to types and specimens. This is why the colonial chapter is not an appendix to the British story, it is a revealing expansion of it. The empire shows how anatomy and collecting could become tools of dominance, turning bodies into evidence for theories that justified dispossession. 11.9 Conclusion. empire as amplifier of the body trade's underlying logic. The imperial spread of medical education did not merely export British anatomy, it exported British anatomy's supply problem and its moral compromises. Where Britain resolved the crisis through the Anatomy Act by redirecting supply toward the institutional dead, colonies often navigated procurement through a mix of local statute, institutional practice, and informal appropriation. In settler colonies, the appropriation of indigenous remains was especially stark, showing how scientific ambition and museum prestige could drive mutilation, theft, and the long afterlife of colonial violence, captured with chilling clarity in the 1869 Land case. The next chapter returns to Britain to track the later evolution of the system the Anatomy Act created, how the 19th century's legal settlement reshaped practice over time, and why, by the Edwardian era, the conditions that sustained organized grave robbing began to erode. 12. The Edwardian decline, medical reforms and changing practices. 12.1 Decline as a slow fade, not a sudden end. By the Edwardian era, circa 1901 to 1914, organized grave robbing had largely ceased to function as a reliable national supply system in Britain. This did not mean anxieties about dissection vanished, nor that cadaver supply became effortless. Rather, the practice of body snatching declined because the conditions that had sustained it, high demand, low legal supply and porous oversight, were progressively reshaped by institutional growth, regulatory routines, and changes in how medical teaching managed human remains. Importantly, early 20th century observers already described body snatching as a phenomenon primarily belonging to an earlier phase of medical education, linked to the absence of licensing and supply mechanisms before 1832. The 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica entry on body snatching frames the practice as historically rooted in the period before the Anatomy Act, when there was no provision for supplying subjects for students. This isn't flawless social history, but it is useful evidence for how Edwardian-era reference works located the practice in the past. 12.2 The Anatomy Act's long tail, regulation reduces the graveyard market. The 1832 settlement mattered well into the Edwardian period. The Act created a licensing and inspection framework and, crucially, permitted anatomical examination, where a person had lawful possession of a body and no relative objected. Over decades, that framework helped normalize legally sourced teaching bodies through institutional channels, weakening the economic logic of grave robbing. That said, the Anatomy Act did not magically provide abundance. A major scholarly article via JSTOR notes that while around 600 bodies were available to medical schools in 1832 to 33, numbers later fell, e.g., 430 in 1838 to 39 and just over 300 in 1845 to 46, demonstrating that the Act stabilized legality more reliably than it stabilized volume. This matters for Edwardian decline. The disappearance of resurrectionism was not the same thing as a perfect supply system, it was the replacement of a criminal supply chain with regulated institutional sourcing and evolving teaching practices. 12.3 Institutional medicine expands, hospitals, mortuaries, and managed death. Between late Victorian and Edwardian Britain, medical infrastructure became more urban, more hospital-centered, and more administratively modern. Hospitals, infirmaries, and asylums developed more formal death-handling practices, record-keeping, mortuary spaces, scheduled burials, which made the movement of bodies more legible and governed than the earlier chaotic landscape of churchyards and private burial grounds. Recent historical scholarship on 19th and early 20th century asylum and mental hospital burials, for example, treats institutional burial as a distinct and expanding domain of practice, evidence of how much death was being handled within institutions rather than purely through parish burial patterns. Even when such work focuses on burial rather than dissection, it supports the broader point: institutionalization changed the death ecosystem, and with it, the opportunities and incentives for grave robbers. 12.4 Preservation and the changing freshness premium. One key reason resurrectionism thrived earlier was the premium on fresh bodies. As preservation methods improved and as anatomical departments developed better storage routines, embalming protocols, controlled environments, and later freezing practices, the urgency that drove midnight procurement softened. This did not eliminate the educational value of freshness, but it reduced the extent to which only a just-buried body could meet teaching needs. By the early 20th century, anatomy teaching increasingly relied on a mix: whole cadavers when available, but also preserved specimens, pathological preparations, models, and curated demonstrations. A scholarly chapter on the teaching of anatomy and pathology to the early 20th century in England, explicitly signals that anatomy teaching evolved substantially beyond the familiar Burke and Hare narrative, reflecting changing practices and materials across the long 19th century. 12.5 Professionalization and ethics. Don't ask becomes harder to sustain. Another force behind the Edwardian decline was professional self-definition. By 1900, medicine was more credentialed, more publicly visible, and more tightly connected to state institutions. That visibility created reputational vulnerability. The association of medical education with grave violation or scandal became less tolerable for institutions that sought public trust. This is also where the logic of inspection and oversight, introduced in 1832, mattered culturally, not just legally. The act aimed to prevent great and grievous crimes, and lately murder, by protecting anatomy under certain regulations, and over time those regulations supported the idea that legitimate medicine should not rely on criminal procurement. Even if practice on the ground was uneven, the professional ideology shifted. Ethical legitimacy became part of institutional survival. 12.6 Teaching technologies. Anatomy becomes partially reproducible. Edwardian-era anatomy instruction did not abandon cadavers, but it increasingly supplemented them. Teaching could be scaled through museum collections and curated preparations, normal and pathological anatomy, models and casts, especially for repeated demonstration, photographic and printed atlases improving standardization, repeated use specimens where permissible. This is not to claim that such tools replace dissection as the core pedagogical right. Many schools maintain dissection as central, but rather that teaching became less dependent on acquiring large numbers of newly dead bodies at exactly the right times. The educational system became more buffered. 12.7 The paradox. Body snatching declines, but supply anxiety persists. Even as resurrectionism faded, the underlying supply tension never vanished entirely, because anatomy teaching continued to require human bodies, and lawful acquisition still depended on social consent, institutional pathways, and public trust. Modern reporting underscores how cadaver availability can still become a constraint under ethical donation systems. For example, a 2024 report describing shortages affecting surgical training in Edinburgh, with official oversight by HM Inspector of Anatomy for Scotland. This does not mean Edwardian Britain faced the same conditions as 1820s London, but it reinforces a historical through line. Whenever demand rises faster than lawful supply, systems strain, and societies must renegotiate the moral economy of bodily donation. 12.8 Conclusion. Why the Edwardian era marks an endpoint in practice, not in memory. By the Edwardian period, the classic figure of the resurrection man had largely been displaced by institutional sourcing, regulated oversight, and evolving teaching methods. Reference works already treated body snatching as a largely historical phenomenon tied to the pre-1832 environment. Yet cultural memory remained potent. Distrust of medical institutions, shaped by the long 19th century's class extraction of bodies, did not evaporate when the graveyard raids stopped. It lingered in rumor, literature, and working-class suspicion, sometimes well into the 20th century, as later commentary notes. The next chapter turns to that cultural afterlife directly, how body snatching and anatomical fear entered Victorian and Edwardian literature, theatre, journalism, and popular imagination, and how those representations both reflected and reinforced the politics of death. 13. Cultural impact and literary representations. 13.1 Why body snatching became cultural material. Body snatching's cultural power came from the way it fused three Victorian anxieties into a single image: violation of the dead, a religious and emotional terror; medical power, the fear that doctors could do things the public could not prevent; and class vulnerability, the suspicion that the poor were the most available bodies. Even after the Anatomy Act reduced graveyard raids, the idea of the resurrectionist remained potent because it expressed a wider truth about unequal protection in life and death. The Act's own preamble publicly linked cadaver shortage to great and grievous crimes, and lately murder, effectively confirming that the public's worst fears had not been pure fantasy. As a result, body snatching became an unusually portable motif. It could be used in satire, melodrama, Gothic fiction, popular journalism, and later historical romance to evoke danger, corruption, and the sinister underside of respectable progress. 13.2 Satire, Prince, and the anatomy theatre as spectacle. Long before Dickens or Stevenson, visual culture helped shape the resurrectionist mythos. Anatomical teaching was theatrical by nature, a demonstrator, a body, an audience, and the charged atmosphere of forbidden knowledge. Museums and medical history institutions frequently reproduce contemporary images of demonstrations and comment on the public awareness and unease surrounding anatomy spaces. Satirical prints often pushed two ideas at once: that anatomy was advancing knowledge, and that it did so through morally compromised supply. The joke was rarely dissection is useless. The joke was that dissection was useful enough that society quietly tolerated disturbing means. This is exactly the kind of cultural logic that makes body snatching so narratively effective. It frames modern medicine as bought with an unspoken debt. 13.3 Dickens and the Resurrection Man, the respectable underworld in plain sight. Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities contains one of the Victorian era's most memorable fictional resurrectionists, Jerry Cruncher, a bank porter by day and resurrection man by night. Modern critical summaries note explicitly that Cruncher is a body snatcher and that Dickens treats the work through euphemism and grim humor. Dickens's use of Cruncher matters for three reasons. Normalization through double life. Cruncher is not an exotic villain, he is embedded in everyday respectability, employment, errands, domestic squabbles. The horror is not monsters exist, but this exists next door. Moral contradiction as social diagnosis. Dickens positions body snatching as part of a hidden economy that respectable institutions benefit from while maintaining outward virtue. Resurrection as theme, not just job. The novel's broader obsession with resurrection, return, renewal, reappearance, lets the resurrectionist trade function as both literal practice and metaphorical pressure point. Later adaptations even played explicitly with the parallel between book snatching and body snatching, showing how quickly the trope became a flexible symbol for illicit acquisition in the shadow of institutions. 13.4 Stevenson's The Body Snatcher, Medical Guilt and Gothic Memory. Robert Louis Stevenson's 1884 story, The Body Snatcher, is one of the most direct literary afterlives of the Burke and Hare era. Reference summaries emphasize that Stevenson's characters were based on criminals linked to the anatomist Robert Knox around the time of the Burke and Hare murders, and that the story was first published in the Pall Mall Gazette in December 1884. Stevenson's key move is to shift focus from the resurrectionist as a working criminal to the moral corrosion inside medical culture, the compromises, the rationalizations, the dread that what was done for knowledge cannot be cleanly separated from what was done for profit. The story's horror is as much psychological as supernatural, because it taps a Victorian suspicion that professional authority could be built on unacknowledged violence. This is also why the body snatcher persists. It makes the reader feel that medicine's progress carries a shadow archive: bodies obtained, stories suppressed, guilt displaced. 13.5 Penny Dreadfuls, cheap print, and the mass market Gothic. Body snatching also flourished in the cheap literary ecosystem, serials and sensational pamphlets, because it offered exactly what mass market publishers wanted: high stakes, visceral imagery, moral outrage, and cliffhanger potential. Overviews of penny dreadfuls highlight how they expanded with cheaper printing and rising working-class literacy, and how they specialized in sensational content that moral critics condemned but readers devoured. Within that marketplace, body snatching sat naturally beside other Victorian fears: wrongful imprisonment, urban crime, corrupt elites, and predatory professionals. Importantly, penny dreadful culture often carried an implicit class politics. It framed institutions as dangerous and the poor as exposed. That made resurrectionist narratives feel emotionally true, even when plot details were exaggerated. Scholarly and educational resources on Victorian pulp also note how moral panic about penny dreadfuls became part of the late Victorian cultural landscape, an anxiety about what sensational stories might do to youth and public order. This is an instructive parallel. The same society that panicked about resurrectionists panicked about the stories told about resurrectionists. 13.6 Journalism, Scandal Literature, and the True Crime Appetite. Alongside fiction, body snatching lived in journalism and quasi-true crime publication. Trials, rumors, and pamphlet accounts circulated widely because they offered a hybrid of education and horror. The reader learned how it worked while being morally outraged by what they learned. This appetite for explanatory scandal, how graves were opened, how bodies were moved, what anatomists paid, helped cement resurrectionism into popular knowledge. Modern museum/history writing continues this explanatory tradition, often framing resurrection men as an organized profession by the early 19th century and linking their work directly to prestigious medical institutions. Even when aimed at general audiences, these materials echo what Victorians consumed: the unsettling sense that the medical system's underside was both systematic and socially tolerated. 13.7 The body snatcher as a durable Victorian archetype. By the Edwardian period, body snatching was already being described in reference works as largely a phenomenon of an earlier era, tied to the period before systematic legal provision for dissection subjects. But cultural archetypes don't die when practices decline. The resurrectionist endured because it symbolized the porous boundary between science and crime, the vulnerability of the poor to systems that claim public good, the fear that institutions protect themselves first, the horror that the dead might not be safe. These meanings remain legible even when the historical practice changes form, from churchyard raids to institutional procurement, which is why later Victorian and Edwardian works could keep body snatching alive as a motif long after the classic graveyard trade weakened. 13.8 Conclusion: Cultural memory as evidence of social tension. Victorian and Edwardian representations of body snatching are not just decorative afterlives. They are historical evidence of unresolved tensions between scientific progress and consent, between professional authority and popular trust, and between class power and bodily dignity. In Dickens, the resurrectionist is the hidden labor behind respectable life. In Stevenson, the body snatcher is the moral stain within medical ambition. In penny dreadful culture, body snatching becomes mass entertainment because it speaks to real anxieties about institutions and exploitation. The next and final chapter draws these strands together: the legacy of grave robbing and the Anatomy Act settlement, and why this history still shapes debates about consent, donation, and the ethics of human remains. 14. Conclusion: Legacy and historical significance. 14.1 What this history ultimately reveals. The history of grave robbing and medical body snatching in Britain's long 19th century is not merely a catalogue of sensational crimes. It is a record of how a modernizing society negotiated, often violently, an ethical contradiction at the heart of medical progress. Anatomy required bodies, and yet the law, religion, and popular morality strongly resisted making bodies available. The resulting gap between need and lawful supply produced a predictable set of outcomes: organized resurrectionism, episodic community conflict, and in the most notorious cases, murder committed for the sole purpose of feeding the dissecting room. Parliament itself acknowledged this causal chain. The preamble to the Anatomy Act of 1832 stated openly that the legal supply of human bodies is insufficient and that great and grievous crimes had occurred, including lately murder, in order to sell bodies for anatomical study. That official language is historically significant. It confirms that the state understood body snatching as an economic, institutional problem, not simply a moral pathology of criminals. 14.2 The Anatomy Act's enduring moral lesson. The Anatomy Act did succeed in an immediate sense. It reduced the economic necessity of grave robbery by expanding regulated supply and creating a system of licensing and inspection. But its deeper legacy is ethically ambivalent, because the Act resolved public disorder partly by redirecting vulnerability away from guarded graves and toward the institutional dead. That shift shaped Victorian memory and later historical interpretation. The old terror was the resurrectionist. The new terror was the workhouse. The law replaced the spade with the ledger, but it did not resolve the underlying inequality. Those with money, kin networks, and social authority remained more protected in death, those without remained more available. Scholarship on Victorian medicine has emphasized how the trade in the dead poor became institutionalized and routinized through these legal and administrative pathways. 14.3 Consent, coercion, and the limits of non-objection. Modern ethics places heavy emphasis on informed consent, yet the 19th century settlement was built largely on a model of non-objection. Bodies could be used when no relative claimed or objected. That framework might appear procedurally fair on paper, but history shows how unequal capacities shape whether people can exercise rights. The poor often lack the resources, access, and confidence to object effectively, especially under poor law conditions that already constrained autonomy. This is one of the strongest reasons the Victorian story remains relevant. It demonstrates that ethical safeguards are not only legal rules, they are social capacities. A system can be legal and still operate coercively if those most affected cannot meaningfully refuse. 14.4 Why the public did not simply fear science. It is tempting to read 19th century resistance to dissection as superstition opposing progress. That framing is historically inadequate. Much resistance was grounded in rational observations about unequal protection and institutional power. People feared dissection because it carried stigma, linked to criminal punishment traditions, because it represented bodily dishonor, and because evidence suggested it was disproportionately imposed. informally before 1832, administratively after 1832, on the powerless. This is why cultural representations endured. Dickens's resurrectionist figure, Jerry Cruncher, and Stevenson's haunted medical narratives are not merely Gothic entertainment, they reflect a society grappling with the suspicion that respectable institutions could be sustained by hidden extraction. 14.5 The Imperial Dimension, Extraction amplified by colonial power. In colonial contexts, the cadaver problem did not simply repeat, it mutated. In settler colonies, indigenous remains were often treated as scientific specimens, and the coercive power of colonial states made appropriation easier and public accountability weaker. The 1869 scandal surrounding William Lann in Tasmania, where surgeons competed for his skeleton and skull, exposed how institutional ambition and metropolitan prestige could drive acts that modern institutions now describe as unethical and traumatic. This matters to the legacy because it connects Victorian body procurement to contemporary debates about repatriation, museum ethics, and the long afterlife of colonial violence. The dead were not merely used for anatomy, they were collected, displayed, shipped, measured and reclassified, often without consent, within imperial circuits of scientific authority. 14.6 The Edwardian Decline and the Persistence of the Problem in New Form. By the Edwardian era, organized grave robbing had largely declined, and reference works already treated it as a phenomenon of an earlier time, linked to the era before legal provision for anatomical teaching subjects. Yet decline in one practice does not mean the underlying tension disappears. Cadaver supply remains ethically and practically complex even in modern settings governed by donation, regulation, and oversight, as recent reporting on shortages in teaching cadavers shows. The lesson is not that history repeats exactly. The lesson is structural. Whenever demand for bodily material is high and lawful, consensual supply is limited, systems come under pressure, and societies are forced to renegotiate how the dead may serve the living. 14.7 A Final Synthesis, Progress, Inequality, and the Ethics of Remembrance. The long 19th century's body trade demonstrates the uneasy relationship between progress and justice. Modern medicine benefited from anatomical knowledge. Yet the route by which that knowledge was produced was marked by inequality and, at times, coercion. The Anatomy Act ended one form of violence, graveyard violation, and reduced the conditions for another, murder for bodies, but it did so by institutionalizing a system that drew disproportionately on the poor and socially unprotected. In colonial territories, the logic extended further, often targeting indigenous remains with a dehumanizing scientific rationale. That history leaves an ethical inheritance that cannot be confined to the past. It shapes present debates about body donation, medical trust, research ethics, museum collections, and repatriation. 14.8 Closing Statement. Why this history still matters. The Victorian and Edwardian history of grave robbing matters because it clarifies something that remains true. Medical knowledge is not produced in a moral vacuum. It is produced within social systems, legal, economic, institutional, and those systems determine who bears the costs and who receives the benefits. Understanding resurrectionism and the Anatomy Act does not require rejecting medical progress. It requires recognizing that progress must be governed by justice, robust consent, equal protection, and public accountability. The dead must not become resources simply because they are powerless. That is the ultimate legacy of the body-snatching era, a reminder that the dignity of the dead is inseparable from the dignity of the living, and that any society that claims to advance science must also be willing to confront the inequalities that science can quietly exploit. Appendix A. Chronological Timeline of Grave Robbing and Anatomical Reform. 1540. The Company of Barber Surgeons is granted the right to receive the bodies of 4 executed criminals per year for anatomical dissection, establishing one of the earliest formal links between criminal justice and anatomy in England. 1752. The Murder Act, 25 Go 2c.37, is enacted. Judges may order the bodies of executed murderers to be either dissected or hung in chains, gibbeting, making post-mortem dissection a formal extension of capital punishment. Late 18th century, circa 1760 to 1800. Rapid expansion of medical education in London and Edinburgh. Private anatomy schools proliferate, dramatically increasing demand for cadavers beyond the limited legal supply. Circa 1780 to 1820. The rise of organized resurrection men, professional body snatchers. Grave robbing becomes systematic, commercialized, and closely linked to anatomy schools. 1811 to 1812. Joseph Naples keeps a diary while working with Ben Crouch's resurrectionist gang in London, providing rare primary evidence of the professional body-snatching trade. 1828, November. Burke and Hare murders uncovered in Edinburgh. At least 16 victims murdered and sold to anatomist Dr. Robert Knox. The case provokes national outrage. 1828, July. House of Commons Select Committee on Anatomy reports on the shortage of cadavers and the criminal trade supplying medical schools. 1829, January. William Burke is executed and publicly dissected in Edinburgh, symbolically reversing the violence of the body trade. 1831, November. Discovery of the London Burkers, John Bishop, Thomas Williams, James May. Murder of Carlo Ferrari exposes body-selling murders in London. 1831, December. Bishop and Williams executed. Riots erupt at anatomy schools across Britain. 1832. The Anatomy Act, 2 and 3 Will. 4C.75, is passed. Establishes licensed anatomists and inspectors. Permits dissection of unclaimed bodies held under lawful possession. Effectively ends large-scale grave robbing while institutionalizing the use of pauper corpses. 1834. New Poor Law enacted. Workhouse system expands, creating a concentrated institutional population whose unclaimed dead become the primary source of anatomical subjects. 1840s, 1870s. Decline of resurrectionist activity. Increasing reliance on workhouses, hospitals, and asylums for cadaver supply. Persistent public suspicion and sporadic protests. 1869. Death of William Lann in Tasmania. Competing surgeons mutilate and exhume his body for scientific purposes, provoking colonial scandal and regulatory reform. Late 19th century, 1870 to 1900. Anatomical teaching expands regionally, e.g. Cambridge. Bodies of the dead poor are transported across districts under poor law administration. 1901 to 1910, Edwardian era. Improved regulation, preservation techniques, and teaching technologies reduce dependence on large numbers of fresh cadavers. Grave robbing largely disappears as an organized practice. 1911. Encyclopaedia Britannica, 11th edition, describes body snatching as a historical phenomenon associated with pre-1832 conditions. Late 20th to 21st century. Repatriation movements and medical ethics debates reassess 19th century anatomical practices, particularly regarding indigenous remains and consent. Appendix B. Glossary of key terms. Anatomist, a medical practitioner or teacher specializing in the study of human anatomy, particularly through dissection. Anatomy Act, 1832 British legislation regulating anatomical dissection, licensing practitioners, and authorizing the use of unclaimed bodies from institutions for medical education. Body snatching, the illegal removal of corpses from graves for sale to anatomists. Practiced extensively in Britain from the late 18th to early 19th century. Burking, a method of murder involving suffocation by chest compression and airway obstruction, used by Burke and Hare to kill victims without leaving obvious marks. Cadaver, a dead human body used for medical education, research, or anatomical dissection. Coffin torpedo, a 19th century patented explosive device intended to deter grave robbers by detonating when a coffin was opened. Rarely deployed in practice. Deadhouse, an institutional mortuary space, workhouse, hospital, asylum, where bodies were held prior to burial or transfer for dissection. Dissection, the systematic cutting and examination of a human body for anatomical study. Gibbeting, the public display of a criminal's body in chains after execution, authorized under the Murder Act as an additional punishment. Inspector of Anatomy, a government-appointed official under the Anatomy Act tasked with overseeing licensed anatomists and the lawful procurement of bodies. Lawful possession, a legal condition under the Anatomy Act allowing institutions to transfer bodies for dissection when they were held legitimately and no objection was made. Mort safe, mort cage, a heavy iron cage placed over a grave to prevent body snatching until decomposition made the corpse undesirable. New Poor Law, 1834 legislation restructuring poor relief in England and Wales, expanding the workhouse system and intensifying institutional control over the poor. Non-objection model, a system whereby bodies could be used for dissection unless relatives explicitly objected, rather than requiring affirmative consent. Pauper body, the the corpse of a person who died destitute, often within a workhouse or public institution, and was therefore vulnerable to anatomical use. Resurrection man/resurrectionist, a professional body snatcher supplying corpses to medical schools. Select Committee on Anatomy, 1828 Parliamentary Committee investigating cadaver shortages and the illegal body trade. Specimen, in 19th century scientific discourse, a human body or body part treated as an object of study rather than as a deceased individual. Workhouse, a poor law institution housing the destitute, sick and elderly, a major post-1832 source of anatomical subjects. Appendix C. Geographical tables, map substitutes. Table 1. Major British centres of anatomical demand, circa 1780 to 1900. Region. City. Key institutions. Significance. England. London. Guy's Hospital, St. Thomas's, King's College, private anatomy schools, Windmill Street, Great Windmill Street. Largest concentration of anatomy schools, highest cadaver demand, centre of professional resurrectionism. Scotland. Edinburgh. Surgeon Square, University of Edinburgh. Leading European anatomy centre, Burke and Hare murders exposed supply crisis. England. Cambridge. University of Cambridge Anatomical School. Late Victorian expansion using poor law cadavers from surrounding districts. England. Manchester. Royal Infirmary, medical schools. Industrial city with growing institutional death. England. Birmingham. Queen's College. Regional hub drawing cadavers from poor law unions. Ireland. Dublin. Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. Parallel cadaver shortages and institutional sourcing. Table 2. Resurrectionist activity and grave robbing hotspots, pre-1832. Area. Burial ground type. Vulnerability factors. Typical targets. Urban London. Parish graveyards. Overcrowding, minimal night security. Paupers, recent burials. Edinburgh. Churchyards, e.g. Greyfriars. Proximity to anatomy schools. Poor, socially marginal. Industrial towns. Municipal burial grounds. Rapid population growth. Unmarked or mass graves. Rural parishes. Churchyards. Low policing, predictable funerals. Isolated families. Table 3. Flow of bodies after the Anatomy Act, 1832. Source institution. Transfer path. Receiving institution. Legal basis. Workhouse. Dead house, undertaker, anatomy school. University or hospital anatomy department. Anatomy Act, lawful possession. Hospital. Mortuary, licensed anatomist. Teaching hospital. Non-objection principle. Asylum. Institutional custody, inspector oversight. Regional medical school. Licensed anatomical transfer. Prison. Post-execution custody. Medical school, limited. Declining after murder act. Bibliography. Books. Richardson, Ruth. Death, Dissection and the Destitute. 2nd edition Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 2001. Huron Elizabeth T., Dying for Victorian Medicine, English Anatomy and Its Trade in the Dead Poor, circa 1834 to 1929. Basingstoke, Palgrave Macmillan, 2012. Huron Elizabeth T., Dissecting the Criminal Corpse, Post-Execution Punishment from the Murder Act, 1752, to the Anatomy Act, 1832. London, Palgrave Macmillan, 2016. Birch, David. Digging Up the Dead, The Life and Times of Astley Cooper, an Extraordinary Surgeon. London, Chatto and Windus, 2007. Mitchell P.D. Edition Anatomical Dissection in Enlightenment Britain and Beyond, Autopsy, Pathology and Display. Farnham, Ashgate, 2012. Journal Articles and Chapters. Huron Elizabeth T. A Pauper Deadhouse, The Expansion of the Cambridge Anatomical Teaching School under the Late Victorian Poor Law, 1870 to 1914. Medical History 55, No. 1, 2011 69 to 94. Knowles, Susan A. A Certain Portion of the Whole, Inspectors, Guardians and Anatomists in East Anglia, 1832 to 1908. Ph.D. Dis. Open University, 2009. Turnbull, Paul. Science, National Identity and Aboriginal Body Snatching in 19th-Century Australia. Working Papers in Australian Studies. Canberra, Australian National University, 2002. Anderson, Warwick. The Cultivation of Whiteness, Science, Health and Racial Destiny in Australia. Journal of Australian Studies 27, number 76, 2003 83-95. Primary sources and official publications. Great Britain. Report from the Select Committee on Anatomy. House of Commons, July 22, 1828. Great Britain. An Act for Regulating Schools of Anatomy. 2 and 3 Will. 4C.75, Anatomy Act, 1832. Encyclopaedia Britannica. 11th edition Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1911. Entry, Body Snatching. Literary and Cultural Sources. Dickens, Charles. A Tale of Two Cities. London, Chapman and Hall, 1859. Stevenson, Robert Louis. The Body Snatcher. Pall Mall Gazette, December 1884. Archival and Institutional Sources. Royal College of Surgeons of England. Diary of a Resurrectionist, Joseph Naples. London. University of Melbourne. A Scandalous Act, Regulating Anatomy in a British Settler Colony, Tasmania 1869. Social History of Medicine. Libraries Tasmania. The W. L. Crowther Collection. Hobart.